Okay, good morning everybody. It's just gone 10 o'clock, so it's time for me to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the St Albans City and District Local Plan, but also today, rather uniquely, as part of the Dacorum Local Plan. Welcome back for those of you who have attended either of the examinations so far in either of the venues. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw, and alongside me is my colleague, Mr. Thomas Bristow. So for those of you following both examinations, we are the appointed inspectors on both local plans. I'll very quickly go through some housekeeping matters because this is a little bit of a unique session, slightly different to some of the sessions that we've had so far. But before I do so, could I just ask someone from the council to run through any fire and emergency procedures?
Thank you, sir. Should the fire alarm sound, the fire exits are located here and here. Please do not use the lifts or front staircase, and council officers will direct you to exit the building via the rear stairs round to the right and to assemble outside the Alban Arena front entrance. Alarm tests are expected today at 10:30 for the fire alarm and 10:45 for the panic alarm. And the panic alarm sometimes sounds in this room, but sometimes not. Hearing loops, devices for the hard of hearing, are located near the webcaster's table behind me. Webcast, please be aware that these hearing sessions are being webcast. If you do not wish to appear on the webcast, now is the time to leave the chamber. And lastly, toilets. This floor has an accessible toilet out of the main doors and round to the right. Further toilets are out of the same main doors and down the rear stairs to the right. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. And just as per other days, Louise, St John Howard, the Programme Officer, is in the room. She's available at the back if anybody's got any questions, queries about where they're sitting, documents, topics, running order, etc. of the hearings. Please do grab Louise while she is in the room. In terms of the fire alarm, it will go off. It did do last Tuesday when we were sitting, and we'll just pause whilst it does. Yeah, the other alarm didn't go off, but that's not to say that it won't do today. So just be mindful, we don't need to leave the chamber. I'll quickly go through some sort of housekeeping matters. As I said, it's good to see everybody back from the various different examinations and the different stages we've had across both local plans. So I'll quickly sort of run through why we're all here and why we're all in the same room. So today, the examination of the St Albans local plan moves on. We were here last week and we're here for the remainder of this week. And today we are discussing strategic matters relating to Hemel garden communities. And so this is a policy that you'll see in both local plans. In fact, I think the same policy appears in both local plans. So today we are talking about some of the strategic matters affecting that proposal. So for the rest of this week, for those of you who've made representations on the St Albans local plan, for the rest of this week, we're talking about St Albans sites. But for today, we're talking about strategic matters. So it is a high-level discussion. It's some high-level topics. We're not necessarily going to get drawn into site-specific matters because we've got the following sessions, especially tomorrow for those participating in the St Albans local plan. We've got the sessions tomorrow. So it is high-level discussion. As we've done on previous sessions, for those of you who've been, we'll go through the matters, issues and questions. There is a lot to get through, so we'll probably group questions and themes and topics together. Hopefully in a sensible order. We have all your representations, we have all your hearing statements. Yes, we want you to engage, yes, we want you to participate, but please bear in mind we have those. There's no need to repeat or read out any statements or anything you've already said in your written evidence. We will take that as read. As we've done previous sessions, we'll sort of lead, we'll ask questions of the council. If you want to come in at any point, raise your nameplate on the end and we'll bring you into the discussion. Please do, however, stick to the points you've made in your representations. It's not an opportunity to make any new or additional points you haven't previously raised. So do participate, do engage, but please do stick to the points that you've made in your representations. I'll very quickly just talk about the different stages of the examination because this is a question that cropped up last week. And I said I'll repeat the answer to it just in the interest of openness and fairness, really. There was a question around what stages the two examinations are at and how everything fits together. So taking St Albans first, we had hearing sessions earlier in the year where we discussed legal compliance, effectively due to cooperate with sustainability appraisal. And we obviously wrote to council to say, yep, we're happy to proceed and progress with the examination. St Albans Council did some work and that was consulted on over the summer. We discussed that work last week, so we were back here last week and we went through that additional evidence and we started looking at some sites. So in terms of St Albans local plan, we started looking at some sites, we started looking at some development management policies. We've got the session today, we've got the sessions for the rest of this week, and then we've got a break, and then we come back in early November, start of next month, to conclude the examination hearings. Dacorum's at a slightly different stage. It's probably slightly behind in the sort of running order. So again, we've had stage 1 hearing sessions at Dacorum, and for those of you who were present at those sessions, you'll be aware of the matters that we discussed and the issues that we went through. You've probably also seen that we wrote to Dacorum Borough Council, so that letter's on the website, and we've asked the council to provide us with some more information about the site selection methodology, how it all fits together. And again, for those of you who were participating in those hearings, that's nothing new. We sort of said that in the hearings. We sort of set out at the end of day 3 that we had some sort of questions around the site selection methodology, and that we were writing to the council to give them the opportunity to set out in writing in a bit more detail how they've come to the conclusions they have on some of their site allocations. That doesn't impact on today's session. It doesn't impact on Hemel Garden Community's policies. It doesn't impact on what we're going to be talking about today. So I just put a layer marker down, really. That's a very sort of specific and quite bespoke task that we've asked the Dacorum Borough Council. And for those of you at the hearings, Miss Leyden, we talked a lot, didn't we, about sort of, you know, the Tring sites and the Berkhamsted sites and how it all fitted together. So that's really is a sort of separate piece of work that the Dacorum Borough Council are on with doing. So the 2 examinations are running concurrently. They're not a joint local plan. However, there are various crossovers in the proposals and the evidence, hence why everybody sat around the same table rather than me and Mr. Bristow doing this session in St Albans and then driving down the road and doing exactly the same session with exactly the same participants in Dacorum. So it's a case of making the efficient use of time and resources is why we're all sat around the same table or tables today. As we go through the matters, again, there'll be some that cross over, there'll be some that are relevant to Dacorum, some that are relevant to St Albans, but it will hopefully all become clear. And again, we've got the site-specific sessions. The sites or site principally for Dacorum will have its own separate session as well in due course. So today, strategic matters, the rest of this week, St Albans, and then in due course, we'll have site-specific days as part of the Dacorum local plan. We'll be looking at their specific site allocations in a bit more detail. That's a very quick sort of high-level run-through of where we are and what we're doing. Those following the examinations will have also noted on the St Albans examination web pages, there's a suggested changes document, and I think there's a track change local plan. It is on the web. That is on the website, isn't it? Yeah, there's a track change local plan on the website, which we actually spent quite a lot of time last week going through. So for those of you who haven't seen it, have a look on the website or at the break. We can try and get copies if not. That's only the council's suggested changes. So just a bit of a sort of health warning at this stage. That's not the main modifications to the plan. That's the council's suggested changes to the plan. So a reminder back to day 1, only the inspectors can recommend main modifications to a local plan. They are, however, useful and they've been a really good aid for the discussions so far. So when maybe the council refers to the suggested changes, or maybe myself or Mr. Bristow refers to the suggested changes, that is what we're talking about. It's the council's at this stage only suggested changes, not the main modifications, which obviously will be subject to full public consultation in due course. So that's that document. Another document that people, I'm hoping, have seen, and I'm pretty sure this has been circulated and added to both websites, is the Highways Statement Addendum. I'm probably looking towards Louise and the council at this stage. So has everybody managed to see a copy of the highway statement addendum. I've seen lots of nods, that's good. And again, we'll come on to talk about that today. So for those of you who haven't, or maybe haven't had a chance to look at it, again, that's on the website. We don't need to spend time adjourning to read it. It's a fairly short addendum statement, but it is nonetheless one that's useful and we'll be discussing today. So everybody's had an opportunity to look at that. That's good. I think it's issue 3 we come on to talk about highways. So as I said, there's lots to get through today. We'll take breaks sort of mid-morning. We'll aim to break for lunch around 1 o'clock. We'll just see how we're going with the various topics and see where we can fit breaks in. Obviously, at any stage, if I get engrossed in a topic and people need a break, just let me know. They are informal hearings, but please do try and help us get through, because there's quite a lot to get through today. And if at any stage I maybe interject or move the discussion on, that's not to say it's not an important point. It's just that we want to ensure that we get through the matters today, bearing in mind we've actually got all of tomorrow, especially for the St Albans sites, to come back. So a lot of the topics, non-strategic matters, so impacts on local road networks, for example, very specific boundary matters, for example, will probably come on to talk about in the sessions that follow, because we've got more time to unpick those. Again, more strategic matters today. Tom, have I missed anything in my run through?
No, I think you've covered everything, and from my perspective, I just reiterate what Mr. Birkinshaw said. Thank you. There's been a lot of effort, and thank you to everyone for being here today. As Mr. Birkinshaw said, there's a lot of information. You can take that as read. The purpose of what we're here to do is to move the debate on, for example, discussing what's been said in hearing statements. And there is a lot of detail in there. So, yeah, thank you for approaching things in that light. Thanks.
I'll take a slightly different step to usual, in that I won't go around the table and ask every single person to introduce themselves one by one, just because there's quite a lot of people around the various tables. I think actually most of you probably have been involved at some stage or another. But when you do first speak, if you want, once you come into discussion, the first time you spoke, excuse me, it's the first time you spoke today, just let me know who you are, if you're acting on behalf of a particular client or residents group. But what I will do, if I could just ask both councils maybe just to introduce themselves, because obviously we'll be directing the majority of the questions sort of this way. So I could just ask the councils, just introduce yourselves and who's acting on your behalf in today's session, please.
So, good morning. My name is Paul Shelarevian, KC, acting for St Albans Council. I'm going to introduce a new face who sits to my right, and this is Mr. Anthony Lee of BNP Paribas, who is here to assist us on viability. Chris.
Thanks, sir. I'm Chris Briggs. I'm the lead officer for St Albans City and District Council on the local plan.
Good morning, sirs. My name is Ronan Layden. I'm Head of Strategic Planning at Dacorum Borough Council. I'm joined here today by Craig Hall-Williams, KC, and a number of officers sitting behind, and also Simon Drummond-Hay of HDH Planning with regards to viability also. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. If at any stage I slip into saying the council or any of the such like, I'm probably referring to St Albans just because we're sat here and we've been sat here all of last week and we'll be sat here all of this week. So that's not an intentional, that's probably just a mistake on our behalf. But again, as I said, I think it's fair to say that, you know, the majority of the sites are within the St Albans local plan, and that's sort of where we're going with a lot of discussions this week. So, there's no matters arising from the council, no housekeeping matters or anything you want to go through before we start? No? Okay, very good. We'll make a start. As I said, when you want to come in, nameplate on the end, let me know who you are and which particular client or residents group or parish council you're acting on behalf of would be much appreciated. So, issue 1. The first couple of questions really, it was a bit of a fact-finding mission on behalf of Mr. Bristow and I, and trying, certainly questions 1 to 3, just trying to establish what the plan area is, what the programme area is, and what a couple of the sites are. So we can probably take these collectively. The first question was, what's the difference between the programme area and the framework plan area? And this is something that crops up in both local plans. What are those areas, and are they sufficiently clear in both local plans?
Thanks, I'll take it first. So yes, the framework plan area is also synonymous with the growth areas for Hemel Garden communities, and those are effectively, as set out in our hearing statement, the growth areas to the east and north of St Albans, roughly half within St Albans district and roughly half within Dacorum borough, whereas the programme area is the totality of Hemel and including the growth areas, and there's a sort of slight margin around in terms of immediate impacts. I'll hand over to Mr Layden.
Yeah, very little more to add on that. I think just with reference to the most helpful image is figure 7 of Dacorum's local plan, chapter 2, that's on page 22 of the document. That broadly identifies the programme area as a line that encircles the whole of Hemel Hempstead and all its allocations. But as Mr Briggs said, the framework plan area relates principally to the growth areas, and that is the allocations in St Albans, but also Hemel Hempstead North growth area, HMO1, within Dacorum's local plan.
Do the plans through their presumably supporting text make that clear? Is that sufficiently clear?
I think that's something for us to take away, because I think that image at 3.1 originally came from another document, and I think on reflection, while it does set it out there, it probably needs a bit of a magnifying glass to work it out, and perhaps a bit of translation. So I think the aim of the image is probably right, but it could probably be updated through a main modification, would be my take, sir.
Say again, just it's common themes, really. We picked on a lot of this last week. In terms of that sort of, a decision maker or a developer or someone from the local community picking up a local plan, just understanding, okay, what does this all mean? And I think, and again, I'm looking at St Albans' suggested changes, and a lot of the changes will be probably reflected in both documents to ensure, both plans to ensure that consistency. I think, Mr Briggs, you've actually suggested some changes as well to your supporting text already. Around this, I'm looking at paragraph 3.50, for example, where you're sort of seeking some sort of additional clarity. My suggestion would be take it away, have a look at it, make sure that the plan, the policies and the supporting text are abundantly clear. It might even be the introduction of an additional paragraph in the supporting text, essentially to say what you've just told me, more or less, I think is where we're going with that.
Yeah. Well, I would agree, wouldn't I? But to me, it comes down to just the clarity of the expectation on development. So there's paragraph 3.46, for example, of the St Albans plan that talks about, and we're going to come on to the various documents that are out there governing what the intention is for the Hemel Garden communities. But that talks about the framework plan, the programme area, the holistic spatial infrastructure framework. So just being really clear what people are aiming towards in terms of, I think you've got that point. And one question I had was, we know the Hemel Garden communities, or the Hemel Garden community has been accorded garden town status. Did you just want to talk about how that relates spatially to either the framework plan or the programme area?
Yeah, well, I need to go back and check, but essentially it has the same delineation in the sense of there's a wider programme area and then there's the narrower growth areas. I'll need to go back into it to check if the boundaries are exactly the same, but it certainly has the same thrust, the wider programme area and the narrower growth areas.
Any comments on that? I think it's fairly straightforward, really. It's a point of clarity and effectiveness. Question 2 was really, and this, we've got some time this afternoon to actually look at some of the policy wording and what it says. We asked, to be effective, do both local plans really need a breakdown in policy which sets out the component parts of Hemel Garden communities and what's expected. And I think really in some of the council said that no, you don't feel that is necessary, because certainly for St Albans we've then got the Part B local plan where they've got individual site allocations. And I think our position on that is fine. We'll go through this afternoon. Ms Bristow's got some questions on, for example, policy LG3, and again it won't come as a surprise from those of those of you who were here last week about making sure the policies are clear, effective. What is it that the policy actually seeks to do? So we'll spend a bit of time this afternoon going through policy LG3, certainly, and that's reflected in the Dacorum local plan as well. But just in terms of the sort of headline way in which the plan approaches this, it's sort of got an overarching strategic policy and then the site allocations that follow. Any comments on that? People happy and clear as to what's going on?
So it's James Marici, King's Counsel for the Crown Estate. So I think we're certainly happy in relation to the St Albans plan, but you'll have seen from our hearing statement that we have suggested that there would be benefit in further clarity in relation to the Dacorum plan about how the allocation, which is obviously overall for 5,000 units but 3,500 outside the plan period, might come forward and what's required. And we made a couple of practical suggestions, which was either some wording about where the council sees those 1,500 in the plan period coming forward, or using the indicative concept plan that we have already got in both plans as a kind of guide to how development's going to come forward. So, I mean, in short, we're happy with St Albans, but we think there could be further clarity in the Dacorum plan about how the allocation is going to come forward, particularly those parts which are obviously to come forward during the plan period in what is obviously a much larger allocation.
Thank you, sirs. I think on the points raised, I think they're valid points. I think just in response to that, obviously, I'm going back to obviously our statement on this, and to just to read that again, we do feel kind of proportionally, it's right with regards to North Hemel. I don't go into the matters of specific detail, and there's a slight element of where should it go and whether that's something more appropriate for a later hearing session. Because the council's approach is intended principally to ensure flexibility on where homes can be delivered in the plan period. I won't say much more on that just yet. We might get into it a little bit later. But on the point, I think, regarding the reference to indicative concept master plan, I'm just a bit nervous about a reliance of a policy tied to an indicative concept master plan in terms of effectiveness. To inform planning application, given that A, it's indicative and clearly is subject to change. That is why it is indicative. And then kind of referencing that within a policy just has the potential to create some issues should applications be submitted, to which I think we would probably expect an application to be submitted for North Hemel before the plan is reviewed. But we recognise the point, I think, about precisely where it should go. We do feel that obviously the Crown Estate play an important part in delivering homes on North Hemel within the plan period. But we do recognise that there are other site promoters and other parts of the parcel who are keen to bring forward their land also. So what I'm just nervous about is committing to a particular area, recognising that there's potential that this site could come forward sooner, could deliver more homes. And it's about that resilience point as well with regards to the deliverability of that and how many homes can be delivered in the plan period. But as I said, quite happy maybe to pick that up and maybe as part of a future discussion looking a bit more detail at the North Hemel allocation. But again, happy to answer any further queries you may have at this stage.
Is this point then, so HM01 within the Dacorum local plan, that's then in separate land ownerships, is that right?
That is correct, yes. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we think it would be useful to have more of a guide, both about what might come forward first, how the development might come forward, but also the point that we make in the hearing statement goes slightly further than that. It's also to have more clarity on what is expected from each of the component parts in terms of development and infrastructure. And obviously, the indicative concept plan provides some indication on that, but it is indicative. But if that's not to be the guide, and I understand the points that were made about the risks of attaching too much to an indicative concept plan, but if that's the case, then our alternative suggestion is there's a need for some more text to offer more guidance about what might come forward when, and what components of the development might be, and what's expected from each of the parcels. And yes, so I think that you've hit the nail on the head. Because there are different landowners, that's one of the reasons why there is necessity for a bit more clarity around this.
I'll put a bit of lay a bit of a marker down. When we get to that session in Dacorum, I think there does need to be a consideration of, if that strategic site is within different ownerships, how the policy is going to be effective in delivering the homes and schools and community benefits that the plan envisages. It's probably it's a good point to raise now. It's one I think we do need to come back to and try and unpick. I'd probably say I'm cautious about going down the route of putting the indicative plan in the plan. What it could do is, and again, this is a sort of not ready for debate now, it's for thinking about in the future, whether or not there could be a geographical illustration of the different land ownerships and an understanding as to how the site will come forward, whether it needs to be phased in some way. I think from a local community perspective, it would be helpful to understand that it's not just one big site. How is it going to come forward? What's the realistic pattern of development here? So I think that's something that I would obviously lay a marker down now, and I'd welcome that discussion when we come to it, but it is quite a sort of site-specific issue. Does that make sense? Yeah. Lady on the end, I can't quite see your name for your laptop. Yeah.
Jo Hanslip from Urbanista, representing Land Improvement Holdings and Lord's Agricultural Trust. Just a brief point really that I'm sure we're going to come back to subsequent issues later on today, but to our reading, the component parts also include obviously infrastructure considerations, and in that regard, you know, there are a number of issues about what the requirements are, what the trigger points are, what the costs and delivery implications are, and to some degree some of the insertions in the main mods in the St Albans policy LG3 perhaps touch on some of those issues. So I just wanted to flag it up now, but I know we'll come back to it later.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of the discussion today on highways, for example, is going to be, okay, well, when do you need the interventions? How are you going to deliver them? Who's going to deliver them? Those sort of questions. So I think, yeah, the plan does need to be clear on those points. And there goes the alarm. We don't need to leave. Okay, so we don't need to leave. We'll carry on. Again, as we go through these questions, a lot of it we will get into. And the first questions was just about context, fact finding, understanding, really. Question 3. Yeah.
Sorry, just before we move on to question 3, this is probably just something to do with numbers and clarity. So I'm just going to throw out some paragraph numbers that it would be great if the councils could have a look at to check that the numbers all align. I know we've talked previously, I think it was Thursday, perhaps last week, about some numbers. So the paragraphs are paragraph 1.36 of the Dacorum plan, and compare that with what policy HGC 1 says in terms of numbers. And then paragraph 2.5 of the Dacorum plan, as the numbers are slightly different, and I think that would benefit from some clarity as to how they relate to whatever is defined as the programme or the policy area, just to make sure there's no ambiguity in terms of numbers. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's entirely correct. And as we go through, and obviously as we sort of direct either St Albans Council or the councils collectively, they are their own local plans. This isn't a joint local plan. But the sort of common sense checking of there's no conflicts between the two. Certainly things like numbers, where they're talking about numbers, either they say the same thing or they say why they don't say the same thing is the key to it. Question 3 then was again really a factual point. We listed some sites there, which again I think are shown within one of the plan maps. They're numbered. And we just asked the council, I think we asked obviously both councils, what the position was on those sites. So could you just quickly, just for the benefit of everybody, just very quickly run through the latest position on those other sites that are listed, I think they're listed as numbers, within the programme area.
Thank you, sirs. I'll do my best, and the detail is set out within our hearing statement, starting on paragraph 1.3.3. So there's 4 sites in particular. Marchmont Farm is the first one. It's owned by Homes England. It has a resolution to grant permission on the 3rd of July 2025, subject to a Section 106 agreement. It does form part of the original Hemel Garden Communities bid area. So it is, part of that kind of, the starting point of one of the initial phases of delivering Hemel Garden Communities. The second site is Spencer's Park, and that traverses the boundary with St Albans. That's to the northeast, and that too was part of the original Hemel Garden Communities bid. That is also owned by Homes England. That is at a more advanced stage. A number of the earlier phases of that site have been completed, and the final phase of development received the resolution to grant permission on the 3rd of July 2025. And that's moving forward. It's probably worth noting that some of these sites were delayed a bit due to the Habitats Regulations assessment, the need for mitigation. They were caught in the system. So just regards to deliverability points and concerns about those, they're now moving again is the underlying conclusion there. Land adjacent to the Manor Estate and land west of Hemel Hempstead. Now both of those are at an advanced stage also. Land adjacent to Manor Estate is predominantly completed. I think there is only 30 houses left to be delivered on that site. That received a resolution to grant permission on the 18th of September 2025. That's more towards the southern part of the town, close to the Two Waters area. Land west of Hemel Hempstead is one of the largest existing allocations from the previous core strategy and site allocations. Now, again, as with the other sites, that was caught by the Habitats Regulations assessment. It was due to come forward a number of years ago. However, it needed to identify mitigation. That has now been achieved and secured. And with that, it has received its outline. I believe all of the phases of development have now, and the detail has been agreed in terms of resolutions to grant permission as well. And I believe that construction is starting on that site to the west of Hemel, and that's 1,100 homes on that one as well. So just a summary that they all seem to be moving now, but it is just owing to some of those delays experienced by the need for mitigation to be secured. But yeah, there have been important parts of recent plans and recent strategies, and we've kind of felt it was worthwhile, making sure that they are reflected somewhere within this plan as still being important to the overall strategy.
Just in terms of those sites, we sort of call them 1 to 4 because that's what they're shown as on the key. Out of those 4, does the submitted Dacorum local plan seek to remove any of them from the green belt that aren't already?
No, those sites are already removed from the greenbelt or were never within the greenbelt.
Right,
originally.
okay, fine. They're shown on that key. Are they shown on your submitted policies map, or do they not need to be? What's your approach?
Just double check. The majority are commitments. So I know Spencer's Park, Manor Estate, and land west of Hemel, which was the old LA3. Just being clear in my head, I believe Marchmont Farm, given that it is not commenced on site yet, is still within our plan. And we are looking to maintain that allocation going forward just to ensure it's secured.
Because it's sort of fact finding and just making sure everything tallies up at this stage. They're listed on the programme area map, and it was just a question as to how it's translated onto your submitted policies map. Obviously, you don't need to start showing commitments, but in terms of allocations, so it's again just a sort of go away and double check that really, because they are shown on a programme area, and again, people picking up the plan for the first time, trying to understand, okay, well, what are these sites? And again, whether there's something within the supporting text or whether there needs to be potentially, again, that sort of storytelling, scene setting, people understanding what they are might be useful, and again, we'd support that for effectiveness. Any questions on that? No. Okay, so we start moving on now and getting into sort of some of the meat of the issues, really. So we've talked a lot in both examinations, probably more in St Albans because we had a sort of mop-up session on it last week, but we have talked a lot about spatial strategies. We've talked a lot about site selection methodology. We've talked a lot about site selection methodology, actually, in both examinations. And we've talked a lot about Greenbelt reviews. So again, we don't necessarily need to sort of go back into that. But what Mr. Bristol and I do want to understand, and this is question 4 really, is having established the principle of growth around Hemel and Hempstead, and we talked about that, how did the council, or the councils, then establish the scale of development? So how does everything we've talked about in terms of strategic matters, how does that then translate into what we see in the local plans in terms of number of homes, employment land, schools, etc., etc.? How is that then translated in what we see in the plans?
I'll kick off, sir. Yes, so again, we do go through a fair amount of detail in our hearing statement. I'm happy to sort of praise these. So yes, it's been around as a concept, HTC, for quite some time, because it's very hard to track down electronically these days. We didn't reference the former East of England plan, but it was actually referenced as a potential growth area way back in those days. But then it moved forward as a concept through what then became the withdrawn St Albans plan. And then simultaneously, as that was going forward, there was a lot of joint work with Dacorum and Hertfordshire County Council to look at making sort of Hemel Garden communities a genuinely sort of cross-boundary area of growth for the whole of this part of Hertfordshire. Again, drawing on some of the learning that Hertfordshire County colleagues in particular had to do with Harlow Gilston Garden Town, and that coming forward in East Herts. And that work had sort of come together from the sort of mid-teens to the late teens. And then by November 2018, there was a kind of collectively enough understanding that we did submit the bid to Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government at that point. And that was a joint bid by St Albans, Dacorum and Hertfordshire, also Hertfordshire LEP, and the Crown Estate as the major landowner. That was recognised in 2019. And sort of sitting behind that, again we go through a little bit of detail, is we did have sort of rough parameters in terms of the electricity power lines that had been indicated in the Greenbelt review work that had been done back in 2012, 2013 for St Albans' local plan. Also identified the M1 and the 4147 as sort of indicative long-term sort of limits to growth, and also again discussions with councillors and residents about wanting to have that long-term separation between Hemel and Redbourne. Again, at that point, the Greenbelt review work hadn't identified the pylon lines going north of the Redbourne Road, what's now become the boundary for H1, but it was certainly part of the discussion. You can't miss them when you go there if you've not had the chance to go on site. They're a very significant feature in the landscape. So that had been part of those discussions. And then, as we set out, we have sort of had a long-term approach. Some of the data goes back to 2011, 2012, been looked at by our committees around having a broad quantum looking at this sort of 60-40 split between primarily residential and land for landscaping and infrastructure. Again, we touched on briefly last week. That's sort of 60-40 split, and then 40 dwellings per hectare on the 60% that was residential. And again, those were broadly looked at in terms of broad capacities for HGC, again in the same way as all other sites when there was kind of emerging sites looked at in that fundamentally similar way. And also, as we touch on in the hearing statement, a bit of work about the Chilterns landscape and making sure there was an appropriate setback long term from the Chilterns landscape. So that was this kind of rough story of how we did it. So it was treated very much in the sense of what might be long-term greenbelt boundaries, and then fundamentally a very similar treatment to all of our potential broad locations about what might capacity be. I'll hand over to Ron.
Thank you. So just a couple more points to add, obviously, with regards to maybe wider Hemel, wider growth as well. So obviously the bid was successful. We took that into account and still say there's a need for proper process and plan making. We need to subject that to the evidence to make sure it's robust and consistent with national policy. You'll see under paragraph 1.4.6 of our statement, we make reference to how we consider landscape, infrastructure, flood risk, the mitigation of the Chiltern Beechwoods, as well as heritage and greenbelt. And we make reference to the various evidence that has helped shape and inform the scale of development and growth. And some of those have been quite important, particularly with looking on the growth area to the north and the developable extent of that. But ultimately, fundamentally, we're still kind of following that process, still in the position we say we can broadly still deliver around 11,000 homes on that, growth areas to the north, east and the east across both plans. Obviously, the scales of growth in Hemel Hempstead need to be considered as well in terms of wider matters. So obviously, going back to our week one, we discussed about the need to review brownfield land, what that resulted in terms of scales and growth as well, reviewing the potential sites within Hemel Hempstead in the town centre opportunity here in the Two Waters areas, and where we've identified a substantial amount of development potential and opportunity there through the allocation set out within our plan. And we've also need to consider with that the infrastructure needed to enable that, and that has helped shape and inform with all this growth, where the primary school is going to go, where how are we going to enable that and unlock those inner centre sites as well, and that has helped shape and inform a number of additional allocations on the edge of our settlement at Shandish Manor and at Polhanger Lane. So I hope that's helpful, just as a scene setter right now.
So in terms of that bid, you referred to sort of 2018, 2019, around that time. How much detail did that go into, or how much detail did it have to go into in terms of scale, quantum, land uses, site areas, etc.?
I was involved in that process. It was pretty high level, I think, is the straight answer. So it did set out, as Mr. Layden's indicated, the broad areas that would be basically the east and the north of Hemel, because by that point we had what became the withdrawn St Albans plan. There was a little bit more detail on the St Albans elements, but it still had that overarching sort of factoring in setbacks from the Chilterns National Landscape and those sorts of issues, and it did have the sort of indicative capacities of around 11,000 homes and 10,000 jobs for the growth area, not for the programme area, for the growth area. That was in there, and that's broadly speaking about as much detail as it went into.
It sort of merges into question 5, really, and you've touched upon it already. So in terms of factors such as the green belt and Chilterns National Landscape, just take us through a bit more detail. So we've got, again, high level, we've got the bid. Again, we've looked at strategic matters around growth of Hemel Hempstead. How did you sort of take the conversation forward? How have you taken the plan, the proposals forward? And I'll sort of look this way, but maybe also look towards the Crown Estate at this point as well. How have you then taken that forward? Right, okay, we've established some broad, high-level principles about the growth of Hemel Hempstead. The growth to the east at a very high level. I think it's fair to say, you've got some pretty clearly defined boundaries there, and we'll come to talk about the motorway, for example. But looking more towards the sort of north and northeast then, and this will then bring us into questions about site boundaries. How did you then take these matters forward? How did you then start to define the extent and scale of these allocations?
I'll take first and then I'll hand over to Mr. Leyden. Yes, so we set out in quite a bit of detail in our hearing statements, and I think it's a classic sort of iterative series over a period of time. I say that early work had been done to give broad indications as to what those long-term boundaries might be, and perhaps in St Albans it might have been slightly more straightforward in the sense, as you say, the M1 and that early view that had been taken on the pylon lines, as I say, as a start of a 10, not finished at that point, but as a start of a 10, because it did serve not only as a sort of reasonable limit to extent of development, but it also set out in terms of that long-term greenbelt separation between Hemel and Redbourne. And then, as we've touched on, over a period of time when we had then the Chiltern Beechwood special area conservation issues and about needing to have appropriate areas of land for sangs, that again sort of fitted neatly actually with that sort of that long-term green gap between Hemel and Redbourne. There's quite a bit of work listed out in terms of the early greenbelt reviews in St Albans done back in 2012-2013. Then there was a new greenbelt review commissioned. There was also work on landscape visual impact. And also, as you touched upon, there was a lot of kind of capacity work, what became ultimately the framework plan, again set out HGC 0403 and HGC 0402 with the landowners. Very important part of the story is that almost the entirety of H1 to H4 within St Albans is owned by the Crown Estate, and they've been a very active partner since back in 2018. And then a bit more recently, some of the other landowners have been involved as well in terms of that framework plan work. And then just lastly, I'll just touch on a couple of bits at 5.3 in our hearing statement around heritage impacts, touched on briefly by Mr. Leyden. So there are some potentially significant areas of heritage that need to be recorded. Right from the very beginning, that was touched on in various things like the sort of Greenbelt Review and the capacity work, but then we had the more detailed evidence done by Essex Place Services, and then also, as I say, the Habitats Regulations Assessment. So we weren't just talking about setbacks from the Chilterns National Landscape, but also making sure that we could appropriately mitigate the impacts on the Chiltern Beechwoods SAC. And more or less, they all sort of headed in the same direction, for want of a better phrase. There was nothing that took us off-piste from that early direction of travel. It's worth saying that we emphasised, and some members in the room will have seen our planning policy committees over the years, we were clearly very careful about what was a direction of travel versus what was then an actual decision, and we're very clear to be drawing that distinction between the two. But then eventually, say, as we settled from effectively sort of 2023 onwards, with the Regulation 18 consultation and then taking on the feedback into that fed into the sort of 2024 technical work. Then effectively by the time of the Reg 19 for St Albans in 2024, that was the point in time at which everything pretty much firmed up. I'll hand over to Mr. Leyden.
Thank you. Just probably one final point with regards to that and specific to the North Hemel, particularly the allocation HMO1, North Hemel Hempstead Growth Area. A key kind of determinant in terms of understanding the developed extent was driven by consideration of the Chilterns National Landscape, and with that we commissioned a joint assessment with Hankinson Duckett Associates. That's on the Dacorum Examination Library as HGC 07.1 as a document. There's appendices through to HGC 07.5. And that applied a very fine grain of detail and assessment compared to previous studies, and that took, recognised that we're getting close. This is significant expansion of Hemel in this area, and we're recognised that we're getting closer to the existing boundaries of the Chilterns National Landscape, and we wanted to ensure that whatever we're proposing was consistent with national policy, and that specific piece of work looked at that, and the outcomes of that work identified mitigation, which partly could be considered as sang in certain locations, dual function, in terms of landscape mitigation, but also being very, very clear ultimately where we should not go. And I think some important considerations related to, well, relative to earlier iterations and the Crown Estate land, a lack of development restricting development on the Gate Valley slopes, coming down there. That was an important consideration. It was quite sensitive views, and views including views from the Chilterns National Landscape, but also further north as well. The outcome of that landscape-led evidence then identified a developable area, and that study then subsequently did a small exercise to look at that in the context of the Greenbelt and physical defined boundaries, to see whether that, we could look at an appropriate kind of boundary that would be consistent with that also. So just with regards to this particular kind of expansion of Hemel through the north and east, we feel that's quite an important consideration that does add an extra layer of detail where we felt it was necessary.
Okay, so let's say throughout the course of today and other sessions, we've heard about how the councils have looked at the strategic growth of Hemel Hempstead. And then we've heard about the bids that they've put in and looking at the expansions to the north and east. Clearly the motorway is a factor to the east, and then to the north and east, and we'll come and talk about sort of boundaries in a bit more detail, but at a high level, what the council has sort of said is that, yes, we've had to strike some judgments here. We've used the pylons, for example, and I've seen the reps on that, and we'll talk about that. And then especially to the north, we've looked at sort of like land ownerships. We've looked at impact on national landscape, and the council's evidence is on the website. Taking a step back and looking at this from a high level, what's inherently unsound? And I'm looking here to more objectors to the plan and people with concerns. What's inherently unsound with what we've heard and that approach? Does anybody sort of want to jump in at this stage? Yeah.
Jacqueline Vita, CPRE Hertfordshire. It seems that Dacorum have perhaps had slightly less option of which greenbelt sites to go for. In their statement, they've looked at the weak sites and developers or landowners haven't come forward. I'm wondering whether land could be sought actively from other owners so we weren't having quite such an impact on the strongly performing greenbelt, particularly in that area. And the other thing that concerns us greatly is making sure in both St Albans and Dacorum's plans that what is left of the greenbelt, if Hemel Garden Communities go ahead, are prescriptive criteria on how they're going to safeguard what is left, and it isn't going to creep further towards the national landscape.
Thank you. Just a couple of points on that. So I think the first point made was about whether land could be sought actively. I think from Dacorum's perspective, I felt we've done as much as we can in the context of this plan and preparation. And without reverting back to the discussions of week one, we did make reference to the number of call for sites that we undertook in terms of proactively doing that. That was alongside every Regulation 18 and included a specific call for brownfield sites, which I think probably is one of the particular points here, is that we should be looking at land not in the greenbelt or encroaching into the greenbelt. And we had those specific asks for that. And with what is the second point, with what is left and how do we know we can safeguard that, I think the Council's approach is actually really helpful in this context with regards to the Dacorum local plan, by reference of suitable alternative natural green space and SANG. And the fact that each of our allocations is identifying land to be identified for SANG, perhaps with regards to North Hemel, it's not all necessary to be secured, but an important consideration of securing SANG, it needs to be secured in perpetuity. And for us, and working with Natural England, that is for a period of at least 80 years. So in having that land identified as SANG and saying it should be secured as SANG as natural green space, we are in essence looking to maintain and secure that land in perpetuity to be retained for that purpose, to suit and serve future generations. I just hope that's helpful.
I think, again, just keeping it high level at this stage, one of the sort of objections or sort of area of objection to the principle of extending Hemel Hempstead to sort of the north and east especially, and Ms. Briggs, you touched upon it, was this issue of the green belt, and particularly the area of green belt sort of beyond Hemel Hempstead, and how the council took the Greenbelt assessment work into account. So we heard a lot throughout the sort of earlier stages of the hearings about how the council used the Greenbelt assessment as part of their site selection methodology work and how they took sites forward. Did that also apply here, or did the Greenbelt review suggest an alternative? And if so, what's the justification for the sort of high level growth to the north and east of Hemel Hempstead, taking into account what the Greenbelt review has said?
Yeah, thank you, sir. So we effectively followed the same process across the piece. So as you say, rightly, the Greenbelt review work identified land that was recommended for further consideration. As always, Greenbelt review is not a determinative piece of work, but it was recommending areas for further consideration. And some parts of Hemel communities were identified that, but quite a significant amount wasn't. In simple terms, H3 in totality was, and about half of H4, but H1 and H2 weren't. And we sort of go through, but having gone through that process, these sites went through exactly the same process as all the other sites that were considered in the Greenbelt Review. So the Greenbelt Review started sort of taking a very broad brush, what is anything that has been promoted approach. So it was a kind of inclusive, anything that's been actively promoted or had a reasonable chance of coming forward over a period of time was considered. So we had the comprehensive list of what was recommended and what was not, but that wasn't the end of the piece. Again, we had taken our site selection process through a member process. We'd also consulted on it with neighbouring authorities and a number of other bodies so that we were comfortable we had a robust process, because we thought it was likely, we didn't know, we didn't prejudge it, but we thought it was likely that Greenbelt Review might not come up with enough land that was just recommended that might deliver enough homes to deliver all of our standard method. So the site selection methodology took that into account and allowed this extra avenue for sites which had overriding economic, environmental and social advantages, benefits to come forward. And H1, H2 and H4, again the references are in our hearing statement, but essentially they identified that they adjoin Hemel Hempstead, which is a tier 1 settlement, again in broad principles, the largest scale of growth adjacent to the highest tier settlements. And it offers a comprehensive range of very significant economic, environmental and social benefits, including housing, affordable housing, 8FE secondary school, I'm just reading one of them out, 3FE primary school, country park, significant scale of sustainable transport improvements and employment provision. So that kind of overriding advantages meant that they were sent forward. But it's important to say that that was the same for every site. Every site was treated in the same way. If it had been considered in the Greenbelt Review but was not recommended, it had effectively this potential second route. But again, in the way that, as was touched on last week, North St Albans also came through that route. It wasn't just for HTC, it's for everything. And that sort of overriding consideration, again, went through a member process and then ultimately was recommended to be included at Reg 18 stage and then included at Reg 19 stage.
Yeah, and this is something we've touched upon and we talked about a lot in the site selection methodology. Just turning to sort of objectives and representatives at this stage, if we go through this process and we find that Hemel Garden community sites are they are justified, they are effective, they are developable within and beyond the plan period, what's inherently unsound about the council's approach to doing that? Yes, the Greenbelt Review was a piece of evidence, but we've heard from Mr Briggs and it's set out in the written evidence the reasons why at a high level the council sought these allocations. What's inherently unsound about that, Mr Hayes?
Thank you. Troy Hayes from Troy Planning and Design on behalf of Redbourne Parish Council. Our point here is one that we've made for a number of years now, and also as part of the previous examination when the local plan was withdrawn, and this was one of the key issues that did come up as part of that. So I think reading the inspector's report from the previous examination is an important step as well, which looked at these sites. When we look at the council's hearing statement and we go to the LPSS 02 to 03 document, which is the Greenbelt sites recommended HGC pro formas, the points that Mr Briggs just raised here, they're pretty much the same for all of them. They're sort of just general response as to why the findings of the Green Belt Review were considered, even though it wasn't recommended. And it basically just says that there's a lot of benefits that are going to come from allocating these sites. So it's kind of a circular argument. They're an allocation because they're part of the HGC. Because they're part of the HGC, they should be removed from the Greenbelt. So I think we're looking for a bit more of an understanding, more detailed understanding for each of these sites as to how the Greenbelt Review was taken into consideration. And I think for the general public too, and this point came up in our previous hearings, is for such a huge amount of Greenbelt being released, I think the public do need to understand what exceptional circumstances actually are. People who don't fully understand the MPPF or aren't planning professionals. So I think clearly setting these out for each of the sites in more detail would be very helpful.
But in terms of high-level conclusion, we've heard extensively throughout this process about housing needs, where the council's going to meet its housing needs, brownfield land, whether or not the council could meet housing needs in other ways, and this has all been sort of feeding towards this sort of funneling towards this conclusion that council has that this, in their view, is an appropriate strategy. The expansion of a town of Hemel Hempstead's size, role and function is an appropriate strategy, and this is the council's position, and an evidence-based document at that moment in time didn't recommend these sites go forward. However, and we don't need to go through it, Mr Briggs has set it out and has extensive written evidence on the reasons and rationale why the council has nevertheless allocated these sites. So I think I'm struggling to understand why at a sort of a strategic level, what are the fundamental reasons for unsoundness of that approach?
I think this is ultimately for the councils to respond to, but I think one thing that's very important is the assumption that there is a reasonable prospect of delivery of the infrastructure that the councils are claiming are going to be delivered. So when one looks to the IDP, whether you look to the previous version that was submitted or the draft version for the HGC, there are huge gaps in that evidence base. So anything in terms of what is the infrastructure need, how it's going to be funded, who's going to deliver it, which parcel is going to deliver what, to suggest that the reason for allocating it is that you're going to deliver all of these infrastructure benefits, that evidence doesn't actually exist yet.
Joe Hanslip, LIH, and Laws Agricultural Trust. Just a brief point, really. I think where we're coming from is that there's been a consistent inconsistency of the application of assumptions in the Greenbelt Review, the site selection methodology, the infrastructure requirements, all of which, picking up on Troy Planning's point, that you sort of go round in a circle. Sites have been selected because they perform well or poorly under one heading or another under the Greenbelt Review, but then the sustainability appraisal discounts sites as a consequence of poor performance in the Greenbelt Review. But when it comes to Hemel Garden communities, there just seems to be an assumption that the site will come forward, and then inconsistency in the application of the sort of evidence base in relation to that and other sites. So I think we just feel nervous that the deliverability and associated assumptions underpinning the allocation are just sort of proving a point that was started with at the beginning, rather than building up from the base to determine what the outcome should be in respect to the site.
Thanks, Jonathan Chick from Nexus Planning, representing Crest Nicholson. You'll recall I was at the stage 1 hearings for the Dacorum local plan. Our concern really, sir, is the council's choice of sites in terms of, well, firstly, the extent of growth proposed at Hemel, and then the location of sites at Hemel. if I refer you to paragraph 1.53 of the council's statement, this is Dacorum council statement. The majority of the land, it states the majority of the land that contributes at the weak or moderate level is not actively promoted for development. The council therefore considers it necessary to consider and allocate land that strongly contributes towards purposes for the green belt in order to meet needs. I mean, this implies that there is some sites that perform less strongly that are potentially available for development in Hemel, but there's also sites in the rest of the borough which perform less strongly. In the council's evidence, sustainable sites located in the green belt. So our other point on that really is whether the evidence base is properly grappled with that, and that's a point we raised at the stage 1 hearings, and I know the council are looking into expanding the evidence base and finding the missing evidence. But I think it's that point again, sir, in this respect.
But that's a point that I'm struggling to grapple with is almost the and I sort of invite the council to jump in, but I don't think either council's trying to argue that necessarily impacts on Greenbelt will be any less. There's a sort of general acceptance and the evidence is there and we've all read it. And equally, I don't think either councils are trying to say, in terms of Greenbelt impacts, these are the best sites. I think what the council is trying to say actually is an acknowledgement of, yes, there will be impact on the remaining Greenbelt and the purposes of including land within the Greenbelt. However, we both have significant housing needs. Hemel Hempstead is a large town, and we are seeking a strategy to expand that large town. And thereafter, we've looked at various things like the visual impact assessment. We don't need to go through that now. The pylons, etc., etc. That's got us to a position. So I think Mr. Bristol and I are struggling to understand is we've heard lots throughout both examinations about, well, there might be another site somewhere else that has slightly less impact on the Greenbelt, and it might be slightly better from Greenbelt purposes. What the council is saying is this is a strategic site. These are strategic growth opportunities which are going to deliver, and I do take Mr. Hayes' point. It does come down to ultimately the next question is, can they be delivered? Are they going to provide, the schools and the homes that everybody thinks they are? But if you're taking a step back, I'm struggling to understand what is fundamentally unsound about that concept. It's the concept that, yes, the council accepts, going to be impacts on the Greenbelt. There probably might be some sites out there with less impacts on the Greenbelt, but for all the reasons that are set out in the evidence, this is our strategy. What's wrong with that? What's unsound about that?
I think it's partly the gap in the evidence base that sort of grapples with those issues. Sites that perform strongly in the Greenbelt, sites that, such as the North Hemel site, affected by the Chiltern National Landscape. In comparison, there's other sites which are sustainable in other parts of the borough, which perform less strongly in Greenbelt terms, aren't impacted by the Chiltern National Landscape. And I know there's other matters to consider in terms of Hemel being, a sustainable settlement, but it's just have the council properly grappled with this in the evidence base.
Just to come back on what I said before, I don't disagree with Hemel being the focus of development. I just feel that we are being led by promoters of land rather than perhaps the absolute best planning way forward. I hate to mention compulsory purchase, but it seems to be coming back on the agenda. I just feel that perhaps there could have been land which would be weaker in Greenbelt purposes and could yet still deliver the strategic extension of Hemel.
Any points in the council that I've probably not already said? I do want to touch upon issue 2, which was site boundaries, but I'm also mindful that we have got specific sessions on each site. However, it's worth spending a little bit of time now, maybe up to a break, just to sort of flag up potential issues and then maybe put things on the table for discussions at the various site days. In terms of site boundaries then, and I think here we're looking really at expansion of Hemel to the north and northeast predominantly is where we're going with these questions. So if we take I don't know, let's take HM01 first in the Dacorum local plan. How is that site boundary for the allocation being established? So again, taking the discussion forward, you've looked strategically, you've started to look at impacts on the national landscape, etc. How have you come to the site boundary that then we see in the plan, and why do you think that that as submitted is justified and effective?
Thank you, sir. Again, with reference to our hearing statements on this, and particularly our response to question 1 of issue 2, we again make reference to the North Hemel Hempstead Landscape Assessment 2024, which is what I referenced a short while ago, HGC 07.1, undertaken by Hankinson Duckett Associates. It's considered in detail a number of component parts, and I won't go into too much specifics of it, but it had a significant regard to the developable extent and the potential that harm that could cause on the setting of the Chilterns National Landscape. The appendices of it are supported by a number of wireframes that consider various options for growth that include growth on the Gate Valley slopes, but also a number of other parcels closer to the Chiltern National Landscapes to the north also. In coming to that, the study itself made reference that the proposals are set out within Section 7 and Section 8 of that document in particular. That was informed by the wireframe photomontage testing, and that is set out within Appendix C. And then paragraph 8.6 of that study then lists how the identified greenbelt greenbelt considerations were taken into account and informed the recommended developable extent of the site and potential landscape structure as well to go with it, to ensure that any development is, and the effects of that development, are kept to a minimum. So it's been actually, this one is in my opinion quite clear in terms of the evidence is quite clear in terms of understanding where the developable extent should go by reason of that boundary, but we also have to recognize that we want to ensure that we have control over the landscape mitigation beyond that also. So it's not just about the housing, it's about the open space, the natural green spaces, the landscape mitigation against the Chiltern National Landscape, and be able to control the delivery of that also. So with that, we do have the red line boundary for the site allocation, which includes currently land we seek to retain within the greenbelt to deliver those compensatory improvements and enhancements. And then being very, very clear and effective then that the developable extent is clearly defined also. So I hope that's helpful with regards to HMO1. Okay,
and we'll, as I say, when we get to the site-specific day, it's useful for now to sort of understand how these boundaries come about, but we can unpick them in a lot more detail. But I think there was a suggested change.
Yes, I mean, I think probably the detail is probably for tomorrow when we talk about the specific sites. But obviously, we haven't got an issue. Certainly we don't have an issue in terms of, I think, decorum in relation to this. There was a change that we proposed, which has been agreed in a statement of common ground in relation to the boundary. So our issues are actually with the boundaries on a couple of the St Albans parts of the allocation. So I don't know whether you want me to say anything about the principal issues there now or wait.
We've probably got more time to go through it tomorrow on those. Just in terms of the statement of common ground, so just turn to the council and just ask why that change is necessary for soundness, again, just in terms of the sort of remit of what we can recommend.
So just to be clear, I presume this is with HMO1, the statement of common ground, is it?
Yeah, this is...
Yeah.
It's Wood Farm, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's actually not so much on land ownership. It's about finding a boundary on the ground, and so we even pushed the boundary to to an existing hedgerow. That was a suggestion that we made because it's a more permanent boundary than what was there before, and the council agreed that that was a sensible suggestion. So it's about the physical boundary.
Yeah, and just to agree with that point, it's about the permanent physical boundaries. It's having regard also to the same HD evidence. I think we drew it slightly differently, but it's perhaps less strong as it was submitted, and we were we were in agreement that that change would be helpful in terms of the effectiveness around the boundaries of the Greenbelt.
The very specific nature of the boundary, certainly for HM01, when we get there, we'll spend a bit of time on picking that because, again, just as a sort of, picking up the plan, there are some question marks around why boundaries follow certain lines and how they relate to things on the ground. So I think there's definite merit, and I'm happy to sort of put that out there now. I think when we get to Dacorum and HM01, there's definite merit in just actually looking specifically at these boundaries. And it's going back to the MPPF points about altering your greenbelt boundaries, long-term, defensible, etc. So that's where I just want to lay a marker down with HM01. In terms of the St Albans site, I think for the purpose of this session, Mr. Bristow and I really want to understand and again we can do the same tomorrow, but we really want to understand the proposed greenbelt alterations and the issue of the pylons. And this has cropped up in a lot of the representations, both sort of for and against, really. How is it, do you think, that accords with national planning policy in terms of, again, long-term, clearly identifiable, defensible greenbelt boundaries? Why this sort of pylon line, so to speak, and what other options did you look at, if any?
Thanks. Yes, so we do, in terms of ARUP's Greenbelt review methodology, we set out in our hearing statement for issue 2, question 3, there's a sort of box that we've reproduced. I appreciate that's not directly set out in national policy, but certainly it's been a methodology that's been followed by a number of other plans that have been found sound, Runnymede and Spelthorne and a number of others. And that does talk about additional boundary features, including prominent physical/topographical features, e.g. embankments. And we do recognise that a lot of that is looking at perhaps more landscape features like embankments rather than just pylons, but we do think that is encompassed by pylons, and clearly Arup thought that was encompassed by pylons because they do, at least in part, identify the pylon as being the appropriate long-term greenbelt boundary or potential area for long-term greenbelt boundaries, not in the areas that they recommended. We acknowledge that. But there's also the SKM work back in 2012, 2013, also identified for H2 the pylon line as a potential permanent long-term greenbelt boundary. It has been looked at, and we have acknowledged the representations from other parties that there could be some field boundaries, kind of hedgerows and so on, that if you sort of join the dots between those, that you would end up with pretty much the same developable area, be very similar. The council is open-minded. If inspectors feel that that's a more appropriate route to go down, to be clear, the council's open-minded about that. But we do think that, given the relative permanence, they've been there in the ground for at least 40-something years. They're likely to be there for a considerable period. So if you've not had the opportunity to go out now, they are a very considerable feature in the landscape. These are not sort of small-scale local pylons. These are very considerable features, and they're the ones that stretch all over the Chilterns national landscape. The government some years ago did decide it was necessary in terms of national infrastructure to go over the national landscape and so on. So yeah, we do think it is a clear physical feature in the landscape, could be used, but we're not wedded to it should another approach be seen as more appropriate.
So, I mean, I think we raised two issues of principle about the use of pylons. I mean, first of all, They're not permanent. They are infrastructure that is currently in place, operated by an undertaker, but they can be moved or they can be put underground. And indeed, as you know, there are many national groups that campaign for undergrounding of pylons. So they are not permanent in the way that, for example, a road is, or even something like an embankment is. They are a piece of infrastructure that can be moved. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we're looking for, according to national policy, for something that's a sort of obvious physical barrier. And the problem is that wires suspended on poles don't provide that physical barrier at ground level, that obvious physical barrier. So as far as we can see, we haven't been able to find any examples of pylons being used as the appropriate boundary for a greenbelt boundary. We don't think it provides the necessary permanence and physical level of limitation. And that's why we've made an alternative suggestion, which I won't go into the detail of, but obviously we have got the M1, which is definitely a permanent feature. Now, so that's not to say, and we've made this very clear, we're not seeking to expand the development in terms of housing, etc., further out into the green belt. There's very specific things that are going to go in those areas, and we're very happy for it to be limited in that way through the plan. But this is more about understanding how we can make these boundaries properly permanent once the settlement's in place. But so secondly, we have also raised, there's a practical issue, which may be more appropriate to discuss in detail tomorrow, because to the extent we do need to put infrastructure in those areas which are currently proposed to be retained in the green belt, you'll have seen that under LG5 we have to show very special circumstances. So that just puts a further hurdle in the way of the delivery of some of that infrastructure. And you will have seen that what the council seemed to have done, what St Albans seemed to have done in the proposed amendments to the plan, when we look, for example, probably tomorrow at H2, is I think they have proposed a change in relation to H2, because they've cut out an area of the green belt that previously was going to be in the green belt, where we could put a building for what I assume is a secondary school. But again, that's not there's no physical feature on the ground to mark that revised boundary. So this is page 6 of SADC E885B. You can see that there's been a change between the two plans in terms of a sort of rectangle area that's become white that was green, and we think that's to reflect the issues that we've raised about the fact that one of the pieces of infrastructure that does need to go in that area is a secondary school. That's obviously reflected in HG5. So it really is just two things. It's about, does this meet the test for a new greenbelt boundary? Pylons, we say no. And secondly, there are some practical issues that would arise if that was the boundary. But as I say, we'll return to the detail tomorrow.
The motorway is clear and obvious. And I think obviously as you sort of go anti-clockwise, as you go north, going through the site allocations, you do get to this point where the pylons exist. Would you be suggesting that we take away, and again, it's something we're going to have to go and look at. I can't give the answer now. It's something we'll have to take away and look at with the council's evidence and the various statements, and actually literally go and look at on site. Is what would your alternative greenbelt boundary be? But so, you know, I take the point about how the plan could be very directive in terms of then what goes where, but just in terms of the greenbelt boundary, what would your suggestion be? And especially as you go sort of further north and then it sort of merges into the other sites and sort of goes around the clock face, so to speak.
Hi, I'll pick this one up at Heather Pugh, David Locke Associates for the Crown. I think we've sort of just consistently made this point sort of since Reg 18 stage. I think the M1 is the defensible boundary. I think if we didn't have the M1, I think you'd be looking at other alternative greenbelt boundaries. But certainly for H4 and H2, I think the greenbelt boundary and the extent of the sort of built-up area, if you like, as you approach Redbourne, is a logical sort of undefensible greenbelt boundary. I think sort of once you're north of Redbourne Road, so once you're north of the B487, I think there are the sort of field boundaries come more into play because you are moving further away from the M1 in that location. The site promoters of H1 will no doubt wish to comment on that one specifically, but I think certainly between the B487 and Redbourne Road and the extent of H2, I think the greenbelt boundary should really be drawn back to the M1, and that's been our position since Reg 18. And I think certainly my colleague has mentioned the fact that that is not to seek built development up to the M1 boundaries. We have all of the sites in HGC have a large SANG requirement, and it goes to the point of SANG permanence. And potentially in these days, the SANG permanence has probably more permanence than greenbelt boundaries. If you're looking at an 80-year sort of maintenance and sort of stewardship solution to that SANG. And we do acknowledge that there is a need to, through sort of good design and landscape, to maintain separation of settlements. But we consider that can be done within the context of a sort of well-designed policy for that site. But the greenbelt boundary, really, the M1 is the defensible boundary.
So you'd be suggesting that it would follow the M1 as it does in the plan. It wouldn't sort of veer off and follow the line of the pylons as suggested. It would continue to follow the M1 up to...
Probably the easiest reference, I suppose, is on the policies map as it stands at the moment. You can see on the policies map there is a sort of a hash over the greenbelt on H2, which is referenced as NEB4, which looks at the significant publicly accessible green areas proposed. And that draws back around the sort of south-western boundary of the settlement, sort of built areas of settlement. I think that's probably the easiest way to describe it spatially. So.
Okay, and then your position would be that then you would be looking for, again, it's not that, just obviously mindful people around the table, your position isn't then that falls away for additional residential development. It's more a point of effectiveness and being able to implement the various things which this plan already seeks to do.
Yes, I mean, we've got an allocation for a country park which will have facilities within it. We have a secondary school and a sports hub which predominantly open through playing fields, but they do have buildings within that. And I think if we've got the ABSC case to make, that is an extra hurdle, as my colleague said, to deliver.
Sorry, while you're on the line, so to speak, the sustainable transport corridor, did you have any, so that's shown on figure 9 and various other figures, I think, in the plans. Did you have any observations on that and how that would relate to boundaries? I know we're going to come on to, I'm going to ask where the sort of council's up to in terms of various work that's supporting the Hemel Garden communities, but I just wanted to ask, given you said that, how, if at all, that factored into your thinking about where the boundaries should be?
Not specifically. I think the indicative alignment of the STC runs sort of centrally through the HGC allocations, predominantly. I think that is an indicative alignment to indicate the connections between sites and the connections from one end to the other. I don't think that in itself forms a specific boundary on the ground.
Okay, thank you.
So just to draw your attention to paragraph 148F of the MPPF, it talks about defining boundaries clearly using physical features that are readily recognizable and likely to be permanent. So in my submission, it's not just a reference to existing treatments, but what might be provided as a means of supplementing what is there. So one must be mindful of the fact that a boundary treatment can be provided along that same alignment if it's thought necessary to do so. So that's the first point. Second point is this. we are clearly in your hands and the exercise of your judgment in planning terms about the appropriateness of the boundary which we have identified. If you come to the view that it is not appropriate and that an alternative alignment ought to be considered, then we need to look very clearly at the way in which policy H is structured in terms of what is permitted and what is not permitted. And I anticipate that we're going to have discussions about the efficacy, the effectiveness of policy H tomorrow in any event. So that's a matter to be borne in mind for that discussion.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it's one that's cropped up in a lot of representations, so we've picked up on it through the MIQs. I think it really is something that we're going to have to go and spend a bit of time actually looking at. One point I did want to raise, and just on that, we will go look at it and we'll have to sort of report back on that. And yes, the consequence of if we think that boundary as proposed isn't justified and there needs to be some other boundary, then yes, the consequence is there would need to be some sort of further modifications to the plan. The other one that I wanted to just raise now is, bear with me 1 second. It's the triangular parcel of greenbelt land that is proposed to be retained, and this is between the A4147, so we're sort of going south now, southeast corner. There's a triangular parcel of land that's proposed to be retained in the greenbelt between the M1 and the A4147, Hemel Hempstead Road. What's the justification for the boundary there?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yes, so it is a modest triangle. That was basically is set out in our hearing statement, but the sort of short version of it is to provide a bit of a green wedge between that far southern east corner of Hemel Hempstead, once it's expanded that far, and St Albans, and also again to provide some necessary public open space that's needed in that area. And it was thought that that was a reasonable kind of alignment between those two priorities, that you would have the green space being provided as that sort of permanent long-term buffer, but also it's for those open uses which would be, relatively speaking, not unusual to have in the greenbelt area. So it was an alignment between those two factors.
And again, just in terms of looking at long-term greenbelt boundaries, what's the sort of physical features that would follow?
Yeah, it's set in a bit more detail in H4. I think it's fair to say that they are less clear-cut when you're on the ground in comparison to the pylon line. We do set out it's at 320, the eastern boundary being the M1, very clear, the southeastern boundary. There are hedgerows and tree belts that kind of more or less follow the line that's on the map. But taking the point Mr. Shadow-Revian's just made, that would need to be reinforced. There's no doubt about it, that would need to be reinforced to be an effective long-term greenbelt boundary. It's there, you can work it out when you're on the ground, but it is less clear-cut than in other places.
Well, so we invite you to when you do go to see it, to have a look at that, because we're not clear that there is much of an existing hedgerow boundary in that location. And I mean, just on the point of principle, we have absolutely no issue with this triangle being a green wedge and policy making that clear. The question that's more important for present purposes is whether there's a defensible boundary for the green belt and a justification for including that triangle still in the green belt. We have absolutely no issue with it being a green wedge. I mean, and in terms of separation, you'll see when you look at the proposals map, obviously there is a very large area of green belt that still exists between the edge of that triangle and any settlement. So no problem with the green wedge concept, but there is no permanent boundary, we say, in that location.
Yeah, I again, we'll go and look and we'll provide sort of direction on that. I think just looking at it sort of cold, I think that one probably it does jump off the page a little bit more in terms of the rationale and reason for it. And I probably do tend to sort of share the Crown Estate's position that if it's about policy objectives, green wedge, open space, etc., you could probably achieve the same objectives through wording in the plan.
Yeah, these are refinements to the strategy.
Anything else that they were sort of some of the headline figures that I wanted to talk about. I want to sort of put a marker down that certainly HM01, there's some sort of some work there to be done around. We need to go and look and just make sure that the lines on the plan, so to speak, actually are justified and effective, and there's a clearly sort of long-term defensible boundaries to the greenbelt, etc. And again, we talked about the same issues, certainly with the St Albans sites, and some of the sort of more minor tweaks and discussions we'll unpick tomorrow, but I just want to sort of put a marker down about we need to go look at this issue around the pylons. We need to go and look at H4, isn't it, around that southeast corner. But anything else at a sort of strategic level between the both plans in terms of ownerships, boundaries, greenbelt boundaries at this stage? No? No? Okay, I do want to spend a bit of time up to lunch looking at transport, but we'll take a break first because this takes us next into sort of unpicking some of the actual issues, and I think Mr. Hayes raised it around, okay, well, what are these sites going to provide? So we'll take a break, we'll take 20 minutes, and we'll adjourn and resume back at 12 o'clock, please. Continue. Not sure where Louise has gone. We'll carry on. So I want to spend a bit of time up to a lunch break looking at highways and transport. It might be worthwhile, obviously I alerted everyone to the additional statement, it was National Highways additional statement, I believe, that landed last week, and hopefully everyone's had a chance to look at that. It might be worthwhile if I could turn to, again, I'll fall into the trap of saying the council, and I'll sort of leave it to whoever wants to take it, is to maybe just give us and everyone around the table a bit of a summary as to where the evidence and where the examination has gone in relation to sort of strategic highways impacts. So here we're looking at sort of M1, M25 really, and those following the examination will be aware that we've asked initial questions about this, so the examination isn't just this in the room, it's the entire process, it's the written exchanges that we have with the council. So if I can just ask the council just to sort of briefly set out what has been done during the examination process from us asking initial questions. Obviously there was the work that was done over the summer and was consulted on to bring us up to date as to where we've got to with the modelling and the evidence that that the council has been doing, or maybe consultants on its behalf, the county council and National Highways as well.
Thank you, sir. Yes, and it is quite a long-standing and complicated story, but I'll do my best to summarise it. I think in terms of places to go for the evidence, probably one of the places to go to is ED 76B. As you mentioned, sir, that's one of the documents consulted upon. I'll just sort of mention that there in terms of particularly for other parties in the room to sort of follow things. We put in our hearing statement an extract from that. It's probably one of the longest extracts we did in all of our hearing statements because it is quite a complicated story, but I can do the simple version. And the simple version is both St Albans, Dacorum as the two local planning authorities, but also as key partners, Hertfordshire County Council, and also as a key partner, National Highways. I've been working together on, across all of both local plan areas, but most particularly for the context today, I've been working together with regard to Hemel communities for a number of years. And we have settled groupings. There's Hemel communities transport subgroup that meets on a regular basis. The two authorities, in terms of local planning authorities, Herts County Council and National Highways, sit on that and coordinate that. And then there's various consultants who've done bits of work. And where have we got to? Where have we got to is the modelling has been undertaken, which basically shows that there are no showstoppers. There are impacts both on the strategic road network and the local highway network, but those can all be successfully mitigated. And to unpick that a little, the main modelling tool that's been used is what's called COMET. It's a Hertfordshire County Council strategic transport model that covers the whole county. The acronym is COMET for County-wide Model of Transport. It does follow Department of Transport appraisal guidance, TAG guidance. So again, it's using nationally recognised approaches. It covers motorway network, trunk network, as well as the county network, all A, B and C main roads and some key rat runs in residential areas. And again, National Highways being involved as a key partner in terms of validation and checking of that sort of as a tool to utilise. Also worth touching on that is a tool that's been utilised successfully in a number of other examinations in the county. Watford's local plan was adopted and COMET was the primary tool for that. We touched on briefly earlier East Herts, Harlow, Gilston, Garden Town, a broadly comparable garden community that's extension of existing large urban area, again with motorway network in close proximity. So being used broadly in that context successfully elsewhere. As I say, as the evidence sets out that there are impacts, you're not realistically going to be building that amount of housing and that amount of employment land without there being impacts on the network. But what ultimately is the result of that in terms of mitigations, and can that successfully be accommodated? And the answer is yes, it can. The outputs effectively, again, at the most high level, show that we need to deliver a series of sustainable transport improvements. There are some specific targets for improving access by sustainable means, but also clear evidence that that is realistic. It's not just wishful thinking, and if needs be, we can come to the evidence. But there is clear evidence locally that there is a realistic prospect of a significant increase in walking and cycling locally. But also we have evidence of specific mitigations that can deliver a successful local and strategic road network locally. That's what's known as Project Breakspear Phase 1 and Phase 2. And those are all on the local highway network. They're all on the network controlled by Hertfordshire County Council. But they're not just delivering improvements to that network. They do also facilitate improvements, and facilitate effectively, which may not be the right word, but mean that it's not causing issues for the strategic road network in terms of access onto the M1. And that's an agreed position. Those are needed within the plan period, reasonably early within the plan period. And the Crown Estate, who are landowner for all relevant land there, are committed to delivering those relatively early in the plan period. And then we also have effectively Project Breakspear Phase 3, which is a large overbridge over the M1. The plan secures, St Albans plan secures land for that. That's not needed within the plan period. That's needed beyond the plan period. But clearly the plan needs to know, does that have a reasonable prospect of being delivered? And what is the situation? We can't have a position where the plan gets built out to 2041 and then 3 weeks later everything falls apart. So it does set out clearly that there is a long-term plan to deliver that mitigation beyond the plan period. We do also touch on M1 Junction 9. The modelling work shows that there are some existing issues there. There will be a modest additional load coming from development in both plans, but primarily St Albans plan on M1 Junction 9. So that will need to be appropriately mitigated. But again, there is already a solution for that. And we'll be able to take contributions for that. And then lastly, there are indications from the modelling that there could be some impacts on M25, in particular Junction 22. Again, relatively modest proportions of the overall traffic at that, but that is likely to be needed. And at the moment, that work's in progress to understand what the exact mitigations are, but it's effectively will be some improvements to the roundabout, signalisations, that sort of thing is likely to be required, but that's still underway at the moment. Again, no need for it imminently, but likely to be needed over the period of the plan. And that position has been agreed between both of the two local planning authorities, but also critically with Hertfordshire County Council in terms of the local highway network. And as I say, it's really important that there is this relationship between the local highway network delivering improvements that effectively facilitate improvements to the strategic road network as well. And also critically, national highways support that. We have As appendices to our Matter 6 Issue 3, we have statements of common ground, what we term the detailed statement of common ground with Hertfordshire County Council that does address a number of other issues which we may well come on to today in terms of recycling centres and other things, but front and centre of that is the highway mitigations, and that position I've outlined is supported in that statement of common ground, and also very similarly with national highways, again appendices to our Matter 6 Issue 3 hearing statement. There is a clear statement of common ground identifying, I won't read it all out, but they set out a firstly, secondly and thirdly that exactly parallels the project Breakspear Phase 1, Phase 2 and Phase 3 that I've just outlined. That is again also reflected in National Highways and Hertfordshire County Council's hearing statements. And it is also, we're saying that it is also reflected in National Highways' updated hearing statement in the sense of it doesn't veer away from any of the points I've just outlined. It's just setting out a little bit more detail with regard to that M25 junction 22. You know, we are in a process. We've been in a process for more than 5 years with Hertfordshire County Council and National Highways. And the reality is we'll be in a process with them for another 25 years. It's not a one and done. Here's the evidence. It sits on a shelf and all gets delivered. It's an ongoing process. But we're very clear that there's enough evidence in front of you today here, inspectors, to show that the impacts on strategic road network and the local highway network are well understood. They're agreed with all the key parties as to what the impacts are, and it's agreed with all the parties that they can be successfully mitigated.
If we sort of take each of these in turn then, so a lot of the, I'd say, early sort of dialogue and representations and evidence related to M1 Junction 8, so there's a lot of work that was done around that. And yes, you're right, this sort of topic has progressed as the examination has gone on. I think the key question for us in terms of the soundness of the plan is, does the local plan set out precisely what is required? And let's take these in turn. So let's look at Junction 8 first. Does it set out precisely what is required? So that's the first question. And the second part of that is whether the council and or developers, site promoters, have looked at the ability to deliver that. So here I'm really talking about the effectiveness of delivering the necessary improvements, be that through financial contributions, be that through land, be that through viability. So two questions really. First, does the plan set it out clearly enough? And if not, what should it do? And secondly is how you've considered the deliverability and the costs of associated with delivering these highway improvements.
I think we think yes from Storm's behalf, yes that the plan does, but to set out clearly that should there be further clarifications and modifications needed to make it even clearer, the council is very open to that. So I would take you to local plan part B in terms of the allocations. As I'm sure we'll go into more detail of that tomorrow and so on. But we do think that there is set out within there a reasonable level of detail. That does include some proposed modifications that do make that detail a little bit clearer. So we've got 14B, I just have in front of me, sets out, and this is for H3, East Hemel Central, a bit of further work has led us to the position of setting out the provision of essential transport infrastructure, the detail of which we identified through the Hemel Garden Communities IDP, including mitigating the impact of traffic associated with development and appropriate consideration of M1 Junction 8 interchange. There are in some further specifics with regards to safe, high-quality pedestrian cycle crossings, including provision active travel and cycle bridge across the A414, etc. Again, there's about 5 or 6 bullets for each of the H allocations in St Albans Local Plan Part B, and we feel that does reasonably reflect what's required. But say we remain open-minded if it could be made more effective.
Just for my notes, what was that in your suggested changes? Were you referring to there?
Yeah, that specific one at 14B, sir, was yes in terms of a proposed main modification, but then the next one I took you to was 15, and then there's a series under it, 16, 17, 18, and so on as well. They were in the existing, they're not modifications, they were in the plan as submitted.
Yes, you've got, there's a few sort of cross-references because you've got policy, you've got the major transport schemes policy, haven't you? It's TRA2, I think, in St Albans.
Indeed, sir.
Yeah. So the suggested changes that you were talking about were made to which policy?
There's a number of actually for all of the H allocations. The one I specifically read out was for H3 East Hemel Central.
Yeah.
But there are broadly similar proposed. It's 13A for H2, and H2 does more directly address M1 Junction 9. So they're not identical wording, but they're on a similar theme, just giving a bit more detail to what are some of those mitigations that are required. Again, there's something similar for H1 that addresses both M1 Junction 8 and M1 Junction 9.
And I think there's also there's actually a suggested new policy, I think.
Yeah, so that's somewhat remiss of me not to have gone into in terms of my overarching summary. It sort of fell off the end of my mental shelf. Sorry about that. Yeah, that was in regards to the proposed policy TRA 0. It's around monitor and manage process. So I say we think there is very clear evidence as to what's needed and broadly when. But, you know, these things aren't absolutely set in stone. You know, traffic modelling is a fluid science. And what exactly is going to come forward when is not absolutely determined. So the monitor and manage TRA 0 is really important to make sure we've got that existing grouping. So it's the two local planning authorities, Herts County Council and National Highways, but also importantly to mention it's also the key landowners. So Crown Estate and Blore and Pigeon on the Snorburn side and equivalent landowners on the Dacorum side are involved in those processes as well. And that is, again, not just to have the policy sit on a shelf, it's to actually be an active grouping that decides, okay, so monitor and manage, these bits of kit are likely to be needed to be delivered by these planning applications, and these other planning applications might need to make contributions to these other bits of kit. And so the monitor and manage through TRA 0, so it's effectively agreed between St Albans and Herts County Council, but we certainly make clear it's an iterative process. National Highways, I don't want to speak directly for them, that they're broadly on board with the thrust, but there might be a little bit further we need to go in terms of finessing and detail of the wording. And again, I'm not to speak for Mr Leyden, but they're broadly on board with the thrust and then just need to see how that might be most appropriately addressed for Dacorum's local plan.
And we've come on to a specific topic of viability, but the sort of second part of that question then is, let's look at Junction 8 in terms of how has the council considered the necessary costs associated with the improvements. You obviously referred to the sort of 3 phases. How have you taken that into account, and can these improvements be delivered from a sort of physical land availability perspective and also from a cost and viability perspective?
And if I can jump in there, I presume we're going to look at the infrastructure delivery plan at some point, whether it's here or some other time, which is INF 0101 in terms of St Albans. And it may, and I will ask for clarification as well, whether Breakspear Phase 1 is number 96 and Breakspear Phase 2 is number 97. It's just being very specific about what those interventions are, because I think as well in the council's new policy TRA 0 you talk about phase 3. So if there's any clarity on just exactly which phases and when and where they've been accounted for, that would be very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, so my colleagues are just double checking on 96 and 97. I'm sure they'll come back in a few moments. So yes, in terms of the sort of the infrastructure provision side of things, we do deal that a little bit more in terms of issue 4, but I'm very happy to sort of go into that briefly now. So yeah, we do set that a bit more directly in issue 4 and to some degree in issue 5. You say there's some quite detailed answers there with regards to the IDP. It might also be issue 5 as well. Sorry, issue 6. Sorry, viability and deliverability. We've got a little bit more there directly on the costs. I mean, the short answer is that the costs are accommodated. So Project Breakspear Phase 1 and Phase 2 is directly addressed in the IDP, and my colleagues will message me shortly to confirm if it's lines 96, 97. In fact, my colleagues said it's line items 103, 104 and 105. on the St Albans IDP. But in terms of sort of the actual hearing statements, just 1 second, I'll turn up the reference. It's in matter 6, issue 6. We just do a little bit, again, at sort of at a high level, just to setting out that we do have a good understanding of what those costs are. Say they're derived from the IDP, but we have a bit in there which is summarising what those costs are. Apologies in classic fashion, I now can't find it, but I'm sure one of my colleagues will be messaging me shortly. In sum, it's Project Breakspear Phase 3 is the most significant cost. That's £107 million that's indicated. Off the top of my head, it was roughly in the order of £50 million for Project Breakspear Phase 2, which has, it's a kind of a series of packages. And it's relatively modest cost of about £1 million for Project Breakspear Phase 1. Everyone's just confirming that's about right.
So those costs, obviously the councils both have viability evidence and viability work, and Mr. Bristol will come on to look at that in some detail after lunch, but just in terms of sort of the high level strategic transport requirements then, I guess the question that we've got is, a lot of this work has progressed since submission. So we're now in a better situation. We know in more detail the National Highways have come in with their confirmation that things have progressed, work has been done, and satisfaction provided on matters. How is that sort of latest position, which is literally, I think, from last week, how is that then reflected in the viability evidence? Because presumably that was carried out at a point in time when there was a lot more uncertainty around what would be needed, say, especially at junction 8.
Yeah, so those phases were still well known at that point in terms of the big kit. Project Breakspear Phase 1, Phase 2 and Phase 3 were identified in the viability work and dealt with appropriately. It needs to be sort of go into the detail of that, but they were included in that work. So, yeah, we are comfortable that the key viability work that the council reliant upon has taken that on board. Also, we're saying that there is, again, a sort of a general cost associated with sustainable transport and other highways improvements. Again, set out in our Matter 6 Issue 6 hearing statement, which again covers, sort of wider localised. To say that Project Breakspear Phase 2 is effectively a series of packages of measures, and those are picked up directly in the viability work in 0101.
When we come back to this after lunch, maybe a bit of a lunchtime homework task, could you find within the viability evidence just where there's reference, either directly or indirectly, to the costs associated with the 3 phases at junction 8? We just want to make sure that is adequately reflected in the viability evidence, or maybe it's not and there needs to be an update done. I don't know, but just a question is just a sort of evidence trail that you can point to us when we come back. So we'll talk about viability in a bit more detail as to where those 3 are noted. Just sticking with the 2 questions then. Firstly, whether the plan is effective in setting out what's required, and we're dealing with junction 8, and secondly, whether or not the scheme as a whole will still be viable.
Thanks, sir. My name's David Bird, Director of Transport Planning at SLR. We're transport advisors to the Crown Estate. I thought it might be useful if I just, from a Crown Estate's perspective, explained where we are on deliverability and cost. I think it's worth, with a very brief bit of history, noting that Project Breakspear was originally conceived actually back in 2017 through a study called the Maylands Growth Corridor Study, which was a really good piece of collaborative work between various stakeholders, and Mr. Briggs and myself were both on that group. And subsequently, the then Herts LEP, now Hertfordshire Futures, and Crown Estate jointly funded some significant design work, to the tune of £6 million worth of design work on Project Breakspear. in order to give assurance on deliverability and costings, etc. That work reached a very advanced stage, was then paused, basically because of the delay in the St Albans local plan. But those works are in a more advanced stage of design than one would normally expect, certainly at local plan stage and probably even for a planning application stage. If we break it down, Project Breakspear Phase 1, as Mr Briggs has outlined, is an improvement to a junction on the Hertfordshire road network. Involves land owned by Hertfordshire Highways, Crown Estate primarily, and then a small adjustment to a depot access road owned by National Highways. There's agreement between all three parties over the delivery. It's likely that those works will be delivered by the Crown Estate, being the primary access into the commercial area H3 and then on north into the residential area H2. And whilst trigger points have not been fixed, it's likely to be delivered early in the development phase because effectively that gets you into the development. Project Breakspear Phase 2 is, as Mr Briggs has outlined, a package of works. Quite a few of those works are frankly incorporated into the normal development work that Crown Estate would be doing. Parts of the sustainable transport corridor, mobility hub, etc., etc. So those are works which are sort of fully costed and incorporated within the Crown Estate cost plan. And then Phase 3, as has been made clear, is beyond the end of the local plan period, so not required to bring forward H1 to H4. But the land required for that on the east side of the M1 is entirely within Crown Estate's ownership. Crown Estate are very content for that land to be used and safeguarded for those works when at some stage in the future they become necessary, and there will be safeguarding in the East Hemel planning application for where the bridge lands on the west side of the M1. Turning to costs, there's been various cost updates over the years of those works, but those costs are fully incorporated into the planned works and cost plans that the Crown Estate have been deriving. Obviously, to be decided what other contributions are made by other parties towards those works, but effectively Crown Estate, if you like, will take on the requirement to deliver those works.
So it's direct the same question at Crown Estate really, in terms of, we've heard from the council some of the suggested changes, and I'm going to effectiveness here on junction 8. What do you think the plan needs to do that it maybe doesn't do in terms of effectiveness around, well, everything you've just told me really?
I think there's always a balancing act between how you incorporate infrastructure requirements in the policy and how much you rely on the IDP. I think Crown Estate are content, if you like, for policies to incorporate the strategic elements, and I think in this case that primarily relates to Project Breakspear. I think once you get beyond that to more local infrastructure improvements, such as along the A414 into St Albans, into Hemel Hempstead, etc., then I think that's probably more appropriate. But those works rely on cross-reference to the IDP.
I would probably tend to agree. I think in terms of our direction to the council, I think generally speaking, and I think this is a point that National Highways sort of made originally in some of their representations, is that I think they wanted reference, so I'm sort of looking towards the National Highways table, I think you wanted reference, didn't you, in the plan to some of the, Junction 8 effectively being referenced in wording in the plan. If there is mitigation that's going to be required, and it sounds like you've done a lot of work to reach a point where you can have agreements as to what's needed, then yes, it needs to be in the plan. So I think your suggested changes probably aren't, what's the word? I don't think your suggested changes go far enough. I think they're probably a little bit too ambiguous in terms of referring to the IDP. Essentially, if you've done some work and you've identified that Junction 8 needs to be improved, it needs to be improved, list it, whether it's within the overarching Hemel, Hempstead communities policy, which I know is the same in both plans, whether it's in there, whether it's in the site allocation policies themselves, I'm not really too fussed, as long as it's in there. The key for me is you've done some work, you've identified that there needs to be the phase improvement at Junction 8, fine, list it in the plan, make it effective.
We can do that, of course, whether it goes in the more strategically based policies or the LG policies or within the site allocation, it's probably best actually at a more strategic level to identify it.
Yeah, because
because of
right.
its spatial implications. That's the first thing. So we'll look to do that.
Yeah.
In terms of implementation, which is something else you were thinking about, that is probably better dealt with in the H policies. And what I'm going to suggest is, you were talking about people being able to read the plan and being able to understand how these H policies worked, is to have an overarching section in the H policies dealing with all the areas, with a plan showing the areas, so that H1, H2, H3 and 4 can be contextualized by the reader. And within the H policies, to have a requirement for the submission of a master plan for all of them, but or an overall master plan, I should say, in the overarching element, and then a requirement for a phasing and implementation plan to be submitted and approved for each of the sub-areas.
Yes, I agree with the need for some sort of reference to a phasing and implementation plan. In terms of the master, I'll sort of turn the questions this way. Sort of in terms of the master planning, just talk to me from the Crown Estate's perspective as to how these sites would come forward. I know it's not entirely within your ownership, but how will these, certainly the H sites in St Albans, how will they come forward, and how will that be tied to, again, sort of coherent, comprehensive development to the sort of north and east of Hemel Hempstead?
I'll attempt to summarise where we're at with that. The foreword to our Matter 6 statement sets out the work that the Crown Estate have done in terms of the planning application for East Hemel. That planning application covers H2, H3 and H4 as one planning application. So I think in terms of the sort of phasing and delivery, we've already got a good degree of detail within the outline planning application as to how that works. The interesting thing with these sites is that they can be accessed independently from the existing road network. That gives a degree of flexibility about where you start and where you build out from, which I think for strategic sites is actually quite helpful. In other experience where you're tied to one sequence and one phasing, you can guarantee that it's not the phasing that you end up needing. So there is a sort of inherent flexibility with the way that the network works. Certainly in terms of the sequencing of development, I think that we were sort of content with the submission versions in H2, H3 and H4 because they were quite specific in terms of what was required from each part of that site. We thought that was a helpful position. That is sort of being reflected in the emerging planning application material. I think there is some use in putting something in the strategic policies, I think, for LG 3, because I think some of the infrastructure will be wholly delivered by the sites. Some of it will be contributions too, and I think that's an important distinction to make. And the IDP really is the vehicle for sort of working that through in the context of the applications and the sites as they come forward. I think that's probably we've got to have a robust policy that lasts the life of the plan. So to start to fix sort of phasing and sequencing with too much detail, I think would render the sort of plan policies out of date. And we don't want that to happen, but equally we want some certainty. So it's a balance, I think, between sort of the fit and flex of the policy. We were content generally with the submission versions of the Part B policies as they stood. There's a degree of duplication, I think, between the LG policies and those, but I think that could be sorted out relatively quickly. Thank you.
I think where the plan needs to go is, and we'll come on to talk about LG3 in a bit more detail after lunch. I think what the submitted plan does is it refers to things being in accordance with other SPDs, strategies, etc. I think that's where it probably fails the test of effectiveness. What I think you probably need to do is look at LG3. I'm talking about St Albans plan, but it's also in the Dacorum plan as well, really. We talked a lot about this last week, didn't we? Having a policy that sets out more clear expectations of what's required. And I think whilst we're on the topic of transport, I would probably, and I'll take this away and give it some thought, but I'd probably tend to leave the H policies alone in adding any more detail, but where you've got strategic transport interventions that are required, such as junctions 8 and 9, I think LG3 probably is the best place for them to be, whether it's under the delivery heading or whether that's tweaked in another way. But I think Mr. Shadow-Even's right. I think it needs to list some of these strategic transport matters, and it needs to list something that requires ultimately the Crown Estate to sort of furnish the council with and provide the council with reassurance and satisfaction that there will be the timely implementation of infrastructure. Now, I'm not going as far as to say you should set out, well, in 2036 you should do this, but I think policy LG3 could be tighter in its wording and more refined in its wording. I mean, it sounds like the Crown Estate are doing this anyway. It sounds like the sort of the master planning process through that plan application would do this. But I think there does need to be something in there that lists the key strategic transport that's required, improvements to junction 8, 9, whatever it is, and just is a bit tighter on the wording rather than sort of letting things be in accordance with SPDs, strategies, etc. that aren't really before us. Is that?
I make it absolutely clear. I'm not suggesting the plan or the policy should contain any reference to timing, or that timing should be anticipated by the policy. The essence of a good policy is that it should be flexible, but provide the local planning authority with the mechanisms to require infrastructure to be in place at a particular time, to be decided at the time the application is made. There's always a capacity for those plans to change, and for an applicant to resubmit or seek a change to what has been approved in due course if matters change. We have to take into account also that we are also looking at this on a visionary basis. So it may well be that some of those hard elements of infrastructure which appear to be required now may not be required in the future, or certainly not as early as we anticipate. So it's important that the policies retain that flexibility. So LG3, I agree, is the best place in which to set out what the requirements are. It might be we need to tweak the H policies to incorporate the requirement for the submission of a phasing and implementation plan to give effect to it.
Because actually, when you look at LG3, so it's in St Albans plan, but yes, it's similar. It does actually refer to landscape-led master plan approach and master plans, design codes. It does say a detailed phasing strategy. So a lot of it is probably in there anyway.
It's in there, but it's a mechanism by which it's to be submitted and approved.
Yeah.
That's missing.
Yeah, I think so as well. And in there, where you've got something critical, and it's the point that National Highways have made, you've done lots of work around Junction 8, you've identified some critical infrastructure required. I don't think there's disagreement between the Crown Estate and site promoters as to that. It's just, again, someone can pick up the plan, we know exactly what's going to, you know, what the evidence says, that storytelling, list it in LG3. Yeah. There was a hand up, but then it went down. What was it? Over there. Yeah.
Thank you, sirs. Roger Flowerday, Hertfordshire County Council. I'm here for representing the Highway Authority. I've heard the conversation. I'm broadly supportive of the suggested way forward. I think it deals with some of our concerns around ensuring that actually sites in the Dacorum plan equally contribute towards that infrastructure. And I didn't think that was clear enough in the current Dacorum plan. So I think there's a nuance here around, and I agree that it shouldn't necessarily be in the site-specific policies, because actually this is a cumulative impact issue. It's no one party actually generates the need for it, and actually it's only when you look at the cumulative impact of both plans beyond the plan period where this infrastructure, particularly phase 3, manifests the need for it actually is required. So to require an individual site to deliver it would be unrealistic, I suppose, and unreasonable. So I think the approach that you're taking is actually something that I would be absolutely supportive of, because I think it makes it clear that everybody needs to contribute towards the solution. And indeed, there's a link to the TRA 0 policy around monitoring exactly when it's actually triggered, because at the moment, you know, it's best guess in terms of if all the development progresses as currently envisaged, then it would happen some point beyond the plan period, but we can't be exact. So in monitoring that situation to establish exactly when it's required is quite critical.
I'll leave this one with you all to consider, but it's whether you need a TRA 0 policy or whether you achieve the same objectives by modifications to LG3.
Yeah, we'll look at that certainly.
Yeah. But I think you're right. I think, listen, Mr. Brisbane and I discussed this, and I think what we were missing was that high-level strategic. You've done the work. You've identified, you know, as a whole, you know, the expansion of Hemel and Hempstead through these sites. It's this project. It's this plan. You know, identified work that's needed to be done. Okay, fine. List it in the plan. Can be high level, but it needs to be referred to in the plan. National Highways, I know sort of National Highways table I'm referring to over there. Is that sort of what you were looking for, going back to your sort of Reg 19 reps? I think you'd made a few sort of points about what the plan did and didn't list it. Is everything that we're saying, is that sort of ringing true? Is that echoing sort of your position, or have you got sort of more fundamental concerns?
Hi, Matt Lewis, National Highways. Yeah, so broadly speaking, agree with everything that's been said. Obviously, Breakspear has been around for a number of years, and the design has been accepted by National Highways. As Mr. Bird said, phase 1 is likely to be delivered earlier because it's one of the sort of primary accesses into the wider garden community. The exact timing of that, we're still going through that process, as well as phase 2, and although phase 3 is beyond the plan period, we'll obviously need to know exactly when that would be delivered as well. And the work that's currently going on at the moment is, obviously it's not a period of time in the plan that we need to know when these are delivered. It will be down to sort of level of houses built across both Hemel Garden community and the wider local plan. And obviously we're not looking at Breakspear in isolation. We have to look into the wider IDPs for both local plans as well, because other aspects of that IDP being delivered will have an impact on promoting sustainable travel, which may lessen the impact on the SRN. So that's where the sort of the joint monitor and manage approach is looking at both streams, and that's sort of the ongoing work being undertaken, trying to narrow down when those mitigations need to be delivered, but also taking into account the wider IDP as well.
And I think, like I said, a lot of the suggestions that you put forward in that suggested additional policy will probably end up being sort of embedded within your revised strategic policy. Just on the phase 3 then, there's a point that Crown Estate picked up on. So on the policies map, we do see an area identified, and that's to the east of the M1. Just from the council's perspective, and this is for St Albans Council, just talk us through what that seeks to do, why that does that, and whether you think that's justified, given we're talking about things beyond the plan period, or if there's any sort of conflict between yourselves and the Crown Estate on what the plan should do in terms of that area of land.
Thanks. Yes, I don't think there is any conflict. I think the Crown Estate have made a good point in their representations that is a little bit of an inconsistency at the moment in the submitted plan in terms of it's identified within H3, but actually it shouldn't be. So it's H3.16 in part B of the plan. So we're proposing a scoring out. It's in the proposed main modifications that are in front of you, sir. So just to take out the words including land to the east of Junction 8. I think that solves it because actually the annotation on the policies map relates to a TRA policy. It doesn't relate to H3, and that's going to be clearer. So we think that sort of solves that part of it. It was, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, it should have set out separately. It shouldn't have been in H3. And in terms of is it required because this is something that might be delivered beyond the plan period, I think it comes back to the doing the right thing because there is, you know, clear evidence at the moment that it's needed post 2041, but nobody predicted COVID. There's an awful lot of time still to go before we get to 2041. We've got this monitor and manage approach, and for the sake of argument, the world of AI actually, rather than making transport smoother, makes it less smooth for whatever reason. It's needed within the plan period. We think it's just much better that it's identified at this point. We've got a commitment from Crown Estates to keep that land safeguarded, and we think that's the prudent approach.
No, nothing to add in the sense that Crown Estate are content with that approach.
And it'd be subject to deleting that point 16. Yeah. And again, it goes back to sort of storytelling and in terms of the strategic policies. You know, it'll talk about the 3 phases. And again, it's just, again, pick at the plan. Okay, we know what's happening. We know that in this plan period, this is going to happen, and beyond, these are sort of divisions towards the future. So that goes to effectiveness. So junction 8, junction 9 then, in terms about wider issues, you want to ask National Highways. So when we look at the work that's being carried out and the sort of evolution of the evidence, I think your position is that that's obviously been taken forward and various things have been done for junctions 8 and 9 of the M1. There is this issue then about the M25, and I think it's junction 22. Do you just want to tell us a bit more about what your concerns are, if any, and what the plan needs to do that maybe it currently doesn't do?
Thank you. My name is Nigel Wharton. I work for Jacob's Sister Joint Venture, and we support National Highways on special planning issues. In terms of junction 22, there is an existing problem on the eastbound off-slip to the roundabouts. It suffers from congestion quite regularly in peak hours, queuing and delays. So taking this forward to 2041, and the end of the local plan period, that is expected to get worse. And from the evidence that we've seen, the local plan is adding to the queues and delays at that off-slip. And so therefore, it looks as though something needs to be done at that junction at some point in future. But the quality of the evidence that we've seen so far, it's been reasonable, but it's not been as good as we'd like it to have been. And so therefore, there is some doubt as to what the exact impact is going to be, or if there is actually going to be any impact. And so therefore, we think it's sensible at this point to include it in a future monitor and manage plan, where we can establish, you know, whether there will actually be some impacts in the future, what those impacts are, and if any mitigation is required, it can be implemented in a timely manner. Just looking at the supplementary statement that National Highways did submit on Friday, there is actually a slight error in there, and it mentions that it should, in the last paragraph before the conclusion, it actually mentions that junction 20, it states junction 22. What that should have said, which it should have said junction 20. Basically, there is also a similar problem with the modelling on the Junction 20 westbound off-slip, in that the strategic modelling is indicating that there will be delay in future and that the joint local plans will be adding to that. So just to make that clarification on that statement. And on that, you know, we're similarly content that Junction 20 should be included in any future monitor and manage plan as well.
So your position is that in terms of the revised text of plan, we've talked about certainly junctions 8 and 9 of M1. In terms of the M25, your position is therefore that these should be referred to, but referred to in the context that some improvements may be necessary, but at this stage it's not necessary to go and look at specific proposals, test those further and sort of effectively hold up the adoption of this local plan to do that. Is that right?
I think ordinarily at this stage for a local plan, you know, historically we have seen more detailed modelling done and mitigation plans proposed and accepted, and you know, physical infrastructure submitted as part of the evidence base. In this case, that hasn't been the case, but you know, we're not in the process of wanting to hold up the local plan. We're content that this is monitored and managed in future. Although you know, there is potentially some risk there that if a significant scheme is required, it hasn't been looked at this stage, that National Highways can't take any responsibility for that, and it will need to be implemented as part of the local plan moving forward.
Just seek your response on that and what you think the plan should do in terms of just these two M25 junctions.
Well, what I was going to say was I think one need to be very careful if that's included, that there's no reference to any specific sites, because if you look at those junctions are referred to, I don't actually think they're particularly relevant to Hemel Garden communities. So, for example, Junction 22, you won't use Junction 22 to get to Hemel Garden communities. You get it to get to St Albans and potentially Harpenden. So I imagine that's related to other sites. Similarly, Junction 20, a very small amount of traffic might go up the A41 and sort of go all the way through Hemel Hempstead, but unlikely. So it's Junction 21 is the key. So I think in terms of any policy that is included or any reference should be very non-site specific. Secondly, I think there needs to be a balancing act here. You know, it seems to me the right approach has been taken in that the focus has been on Junction 8 and then Junction 9. They're the two most relevant junctions, and then Junction 21. There's no issues there. If you start to go along the M25, yeah, you're getting quite remote from the sites, and hence a more sort of graded approach with a monitor and manage approach seems a reasonable approach to take at this stage, and I don't think one needs that detail. And that's my experience of sort of other similar local plan experiences.
Your suggested additional policy on
Yeah, that is trying to pick that up. So exactly that TRA's area, that's one of the things that it's seeking to do, is to pick up those wider impacts. I think Mr. Burber is exactly right that it's going to be pretty modest impacts from HGC, so I don't sort of want to stray into wider. We've got separate sessions in November on local plan as a whole, but certainly we're content that TRA 0 is picking up that monitor and manage. I think Mr. Walton set out that it's not about needing a scheme now, it's about a monitor and manage to see what might be needed. The impacts are really very small proportions of the overall on those junctions, given the distance some way away. So yeah, we're content that we will pick that up through TRA 0. We're in active dialogue with National Highways and County Council to get some appropriate wording on that. We think we're pretty nearly there, but we're very happy to add in the M25 Junction 20. Got to be slightly careful in the fact that M25 Junction 20 sits within Dacorum's area. But again, we don't think in terms of the MPPF support for cross-boundary provision of infrastructure. We're happy as long as we're careful about how we word that's very doable. I would just say also, I think Mr. Flauday might want to chip in as well, because obviously County Council very deeply involved in this process as well.
I think you're probably right. I think what the plan needs to do is make that sort of differentiate between the two. You've looked at junctions 8 and 9, and you've got some detailed modelling around there, and some sounds like some quite detailed and advanced requirements. Great, list those in the plan. Where we start to get further afield, I'm not saying it's not important, but I think your plan probably needs to take a slightly different approach in terms of the council's suggested wording about the monitor and manage, and it recognises everything you've just said, really. So I think two sort of emphasis there. Emphasis on the plan around what does the Hemel Garden communities need in terms of its mitigation. That's a project Breakspear. Right, great, list it. It's the development requirement. Anything else, so we're going sort of further afield, potentially is relevant. But the plan needs to recognise that. But it's not at the same level of detail. It's not this is a site you've allocated and it's going to have this impact and this is the mitigation. Does that sort of make sense? It's differentiating between the two.
It does make sense. I would add, however, that absent any information put before you by National Highways about the impact on the M25, it should be remembered that if there is an impact which is directly referable to this development, it would be a material consideration at the application stage, irrespective of what's in the policy. And I'd be very reluctant, actually, to identify this as a problem at this stage, when in fact it may not be one at all. It may not even signify.
It may be that you have your revised LG3, which is referring to the likes of Project Breakspear, etc. And it may be, because this is the point about it's the whole plan impact, it may be that in your revised transport policy, and the name of which has escaped me, but it might be that this M25 monitor and manage issue is something that's probably comes back into the plan there, and so it separates the issue out between Hemel Garden communities and what this needs, and it is a wider.
Well, I'm not sure that that's right either.
Okay.
Forgive me for saying so. Because the whole point about the development management policies and the allocations is that they should identify what the impacts are so that we can require that mitigation to be provided through the policy mechanism. There is no evidence before you that the M25 is going to be adversely affected by any individual allocation. And that's why I'm suggesting it's not a matter that needs to be addressed at this stage.
I think we concur on that point, that it's not a matter for any individual site. The evidence that we've seen is for the local plan as a whole and the joint local plans as a whole, rather than Hemel Garden communities. So that's the way the evidence has been presented to us. We haven't seen any evidence relating singularly to Hemel Garden communities.
I think on that basis, then yes, it only needs the revised LG3s need to refer to you're effectively your junction 8 and 9 then, if that's the position. Yeah.
Thank you, sirs. Yeah, I just thought I would sort of add some insights from the County Council's perspective, I suppose. So it wouldn't be unexpected that 3 of the junctions on the M25 and the busiest motorway network in the country in a forecast future scenario are going to have some challenges associated with them. Particularly you heard from National Highways that there's an existing issue at junction 22. So when you actually look into the detail of the percentage of traffic generated from the growth that's actually contributing towards this, it's negligible. So it wouldn't be reasonable to expect the development to, in effect, deliver a solution to a junction improvement that might cost billions. So I think we accept that the growth and the development should contribute appropriately towards any mitigation. Indeed, I think junction 22, we think there's probably a signalising solution that may alleviate the problem, but in the longer term, there's probably bigger solutions that need to be delivered on that part of the network, which aren't solely reliant upon the growth that's proposed in these plans.
I'll leave it with the council, but it's whether, and it potentially applies to both, it's whether or not there's something within your wider transport strategy policies where there's a recognition of this as a potential consideration rather than anything specific for the Hemel Garden community policies.
Yeah, we'll have a look at it on that basis.
They were the questions that I had and that I wanted to go through. I said that the key things was really making sure that where you've identified something that's needed, it's in the plan, and making sure you've tested it and costed it and it can actually be deliverable and effective. I'll use the subsequent sessions, certainly tomorrow, to unpick any concerns people have got about local roads and local impacts. But was there anything at this stage that people wanted to raise? Said the questions are all sort of grouped together really. There's one more question I've got on modal shift, but just in terms of impacts and what the plan says and requirements, is there anything that anybody wants to say on strategic highway matters? Lady at the end, yeah.
Just a brief point, linking back to costings and viability, which perhaps we're going to turn to later. In clarifying the strategic and local level policy requirements, infrastructure requirements, I just flag up that, for example, INF 0102, the infrastructure schedule to the IDP has a TBC figure for the phase 2 works for Breakspear roundabout. And I appreciate that obviously there's a lag time and work's going on and so on and so forth, but I just raised the point now that obviously some of the viability testing has obviously needed to be carried out without the benefit of that information, and therefore assumptions have been made.
Sorry, that was a sort of the lunchtime task that I set the council really, is to making sure, can you point us to where these things are costed? And,
well, it's I would say row 104 of INF 0102 Appendix A1 has TBC as the costing figure,
and then
not figure.
And then how that's reflected in the viability
in subsequent,
assessment. Because I don't know, I'm making a wild accusation. I'm sure the council's viability consultants will tell me otherwise. But it may be that there's some sort of broader costs per plot within there to deal with certain items of infrastructure. Tom, did you want to say?
No, you said what I was going to say broadly, but I know the council already mentioned, sorry, so yes, that is the task over lunch, and the council have already mentioned that line 104 was the combination of a number of different strands, so I'm sure you're going to clarify that in any event. Thank you.
And this goes back to a classic why I always sort of guard against plans saying something should be in accordance with an IDP, because an IDP is a living document, it changes, it's meant to be updated, that's its role, that's its function. Things change, and so that's why I would say to council, row back on policy wording that says something should be in accordance with the IDP, because it will change. Last question for me really before lunch was just around, and this was I think question 7 within the MIQs, was the issue about modal shift in the evidence. Could you just talk me through what the evidence assumes in terms of modal shift, and then maybe who you've agreed that with, it be National Highways or the County Council?
Yeah, thank you. So, it's mode shift has come up a number of places. We do address it in our hearing statement. There's broadly speaking, there's a town-wide sustainable transport network target of 60% of all journeys starting or ending within HCC growth areas, and 40% of all journeys starting or ending within the existing town of Hemel to be undertaken by active and sustainable modes. But importantly, that's by 2050. So it's not based on the network as it exists today. It'll be a very different network by then. The reference I gave you was from HCC Transport Vision and Strategy, but that's similarly taken up in LG3. And then the work on modal shift is around at 7.3 in our hearing statement, opportunities to shift mode work, shows there's very high potential to shift modes. The district-wide level, that's been dealt with in Snommel's references, INF 09.12, the Snowman's modal shift report, And then specifically in relation to HGC, there's its own document, HGC 05.03, Hemel Hempstead Modal Shift Study. And that sets out quite a number of sort of findings based on assumptions. But it's important that sets out that that's effectively a worst case scenario, assuming the growth area residents will exhibit similar habits to existing Hemel residents, and also that there wouldn't be any significant infrastructure developments, and that no internalisation of trips would occur due to the provision of facilities within the development, because we're taking a very much a sort of worst case scenario as things stand today approach. But even allowing for that, there's really quite significant shift to more sustainable modes. And again, some of that is because people are having facilities provided close to them. You know, because HGC is a cohesive package where people will have primary schools and local centres and facilities close to them, there is just inherently less need to get into the car for those longer trips because the trips are much shorter, so they are inherently able to be more sustainable. It's also picked up a bit in terms of how that's been taken into account in the modelling. We put it 7.6 in our hearing statement. It references document ED76B, the local plan modelling narrative, because that's probably the simplest way of picking it up. It has a bit in the executive summary, and then there's a bit at 7.7 where it has table 3.1, the scenario overview. So we had opportunity shift mode tool I've just mentioned was included. So there are assumptions based on that. As I say, they're not hugely optimistic assumptions. They're pretty reasonable. They're pretty modest shift over a period of time, directly in line with what were the findings of that mode shift report, as I say, which was pretty modest. It doesn't go, and we're assuming that we're meeting those 2050 targets straight away or anything like that. It's a much more modest set of assumptions. But those assumptions are modelled in. You know, it's the right thing to do for that work to do. And I say it's the latter paragraphs at question 7 sort of sets out the detail schedule on that. But I say some modest assumptions for modal shift is the overall message.
Was that position agreed with the County Council? Yeah, you happy with that? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, comments, observations people want to make in terms of some of the strategic highway matters? No? Mr. Bristow? No, thank you. No? Okay, we will adjourn for lunch. As I said, if we can sort of task the council with that bit of lunchtime fact finding, and we'll resume back at 2 o'clock, please. Thank you.